My son-in-law humiliated me in my own home. He acted like the $2.5 million estate was his and forced me out into the pouring rain. My daughter sat at the dining table sipping her wine and said absolutely nothing, so I walked away in silence and decided to let the law speak for me. The next day, everything changed, and he deeply regretted his actions. I am Maxine. I am 62 years old, a retired forensic accountant, and a widow who thought she knew her own flesh and blood. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your intelligence. The booming sound of laughter and clinking crystal glasses echoed up the grand mahogany staircase of my home in Buckhead, Atlanta. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and I had just woken up from a light nap wearing my comfortable silk robe and a pair of soft slippers. I was parched. I simply wanted to walk down to my own kitchen, a kitchen I had meticulously designed with custom marble countertops and imported oak cabinets to pour myself a glass of cold bottled water. As I slowly descended the steps, running my hand along the polished banister, the sheer volume of the gathering in my formal dining room became apparent. Bradley, my 35-year-old white son-in-law, was holding court. He stood at the head of my custom 12-seater dining table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that I knew for a fact was purchased using his wife's credit card. Surrounding him were 6 older, wealthy-looking white men in expensive suits smoking cigars and drinking my late husband's vintage scotch. These were his angel investors, the men he was desperately trying to charm in order to fund his supposedly revolutionary tech startup. I reached the bottom of the stairs and took 2 steps toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. That is when Bradley spotted me. The arrogant, confident smirk on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. He excused himself from the table with a fake, practiced laugh and marched over to me, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. Before I could even reach the kitchen island, he stepped right into my path. He was tall, over 6 feet, and he aggressively used his frame to physically block me from entering the room. "Maxine, what are you doing down here?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, aggressive whisper so his wealthy guests would not hear. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute disdain as they took in my nightgown and robe. I looked back at him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "I live here, Bradley. I am getting a glass of water," I replied quietly, maintaining direct eye contact. He leaned in closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You are embarrassing me," he sneered. "I am trying to secure $2 million in seed funding tonight. These are elite investors, Maxine. They do not need to see my mother-in-law wandering around like a ghost in her pajamas." The sheer audacity of his words almost made me laugh out loud. I bought this $2.5 million house entirely in cash 3 years ago, shortly after my husband Marcus passed away. It was my sanctuary. It was paid for by 35 years of meticulously dismantling corrupt corporations, tracking offshore bank accounts, and hiding assets as a top-tier forensic accountant. I had worked twice as hard and been twice as smart as every man in my field to build my wealth. Bradley and my daughter Nia had begged me to let them move in a year ago. It was only supposed to be temporary. A few months Nia had pleaded with tears in her eyes just until Bradley gets his startup off the ground. "We want to save on rent so we can invest in his dream." I opened my doors to them out of love for my only child. I gave them the entire east wing of the 2nd floor. I never charged them a dime. Now this entitled boy was standing in the foyer of the house I owned, telling me I was an embarrassment. I maintained my composure, though my mind was already cataloging his transgressions like a ledger. I shifted my weight, attempting to step around his large frame. "Excuse me, Bradley?" I said, keeping my tone polite but remarkably firm. "I will just grab my water and head back upstairs to my private quarters. You can continue your little presentation without interruption." He shifted again, blocking me a second time, his jaw clenched tight with poorly hidden rage. "No, you do not understand," he whispered aggressively, his face turning a blotchy red color. The pitch went much longer than expected. "The weather is terrible outside. A few of the investors had a lot to drink and they live all the way out in the northern suburbs. I offered them the guest rooms for the night. All the guest rooms, including yours." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the heavy air of the hallway. "You offered them my master bedroom on the ground floor," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. He nodded completely, missing the dangerous undercurrent in my tone. "Yes, it is the biggest room, and it has the ensuite bathroom they prefer. I already had the maid change the sheets and move your things out while you were napping in the reading room upstairs." Before I could fully process the violation of him having the staff clear out my personal bedroom, he reached into the hall closet, grabbed my heavy winter trench coat, and practically shoved it into my arms. "You need to leave for the night," he commanded, casually adjusting his expensive silk tie. "There is a motel a few miles down the highway. I will reimburse you for the room tomorrow morning. Just go out through the garage so they do not see you leave." "It is just for one night, Maxine. Do not make a scene and ruin this massive opportunity for me. I am the man of this house now, and I need to provide for my family. The man of the house." He actually said that to me with a straight face. A man who had not paid a single utility bill, property tax, or grocery receipt in 12 long months. A man who forged a fake narrative of self-made success to his wealthy friends while living completely off the wealth of a black woman he clearly despised. Instead of reacting to his blatant disrespect, I looked past his shoulder, looking straight into the dining room. There, sitting quietly at the edge of the large table, was my daughter Nia. My beautiful 32-year-old daughter, whom I had sacrificed so much to put through an Ivy League college debt-free. She was wearing a stunning designer dress, laughing politely at a joke one of the older investors had just made. She felt my gaze. She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes across the distance of the room. She saw Bradley physically blocking my path. She saw him shoving my heavy coat into my chest. She saw everything that was happening. For a brief, agonizing second, I waited. I waited for the fire I had tried so hard to instill in her to spark. I waited for her to stand up, walk over to her husband, and remind him exactly whose roof he was standing under. I waited for her to protect her mother the way I had protected her for her entire life. Instead, Nia looked away. She picked up her crystal wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine, and turned her attention back to the men at the table, leaving her mother to be thrown out into the cold, pouring rain. A profound, icy clarity washed over me in that exact moment. The deep pain of my daughter's ultimate betrayal was sharp tearing at my heart. But it quickly hardened into something much colder and much more dangerous. I did not scream. I did not throw a fit, nor did I loudly demand my legal rights as the homeowner. Arguing with a fool in front of an audience only proves there are two fools in the room. As a career forensic accountant, I knew better than anyone that the loudest roar a woman can make is absolute silence before she completely dismantles you piece by piece. I looked back at Bradley. He was waiting for a fight, his shoulders tense, ready to play the victim to his investors if I raised my voice and made a scene. But I simply smiled. It was a cold, flat smile that did not reach my eyes. "Okay, Bradley," I said softly. "I will go." I slipped my arms into my trench coat, turned around without another word, and walked out the side door into the freezing Georgia rain. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally established his dominance over me. He had no idea that by kicking me out of my own house and forcing me into the night, he had just handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to destroy his entire life. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets as the valet opened the door to my town car. I did not drive myself, of course. I had called my private driver the moment I stepped out of my house. The cold Georgia rain soaked the shoulders of my trench coat, but the chill did not reach my bones. My mind was already leagues away from the pathetic display I had just left behind in my own dining room. Bradley had suggested a cheap motel down the highway. He truly believed I was a helpless elderly widow living on a fixed pension who had somehow lucked into a Buckhead mansion. He had no idea who I really was. I instructed my driver to take me straight to the Four Seasons Hotel in Midtown Atlanta. When I walked through the grand glass doors, the concierge greeted me by name. I have been a platinum member for over 2 decades. I bypassed the regular check-in desk and was escorted directly to the top floor. I booked the presidential suite for the night. The cost was $4,000, and I paid for it using the black card I kept tucked inside my coat pocket. The suite was a sprawling masterpiece of modern luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline blurred slightly by the relentless rain. I took off my damp coat and handed it to the attendant, who promised to have it professionally dried and pressed by morning. Once I was finally alone, I walked over to the massive wet bar and poured myself a generous glass of sparkling water. I stood by the window looking out over the city that I had conquered through 35 years of relentless hard work. That is when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my son-in-law. It read, "Thanks for understanding, Maxine. Do not come back until tomorrow afternoon." He did not even bother to use proper grammar. There was no apology for kicking me out into the storm. There was only the arrogant dismissal of a mediocre man who thought he had successfully put a powerful woman in her place. I stared at the message for a long time. Any other mother might have broken down and cried. Any other grandmother might have called her friends to weep about the cruelty of her family. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are a waste of hydration, and emotion is a liability when you are preparing for war. Instead of crying, I went to my overnight bag and pulled out my primary weapon. It was not a gun or a knife. It was a sleek silver laptop, custom-built with military-grade encryption. I carried it everywhere. Old habits from my days hunting down white-collar criminals die hard. I sat down at the heavy oak dining table in the center of the suite. I connected to my private encrypted server. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The hurt mother was gone. The betrayed widow was gone. The only person left in the room was Maxine, the ruthless forensic accountant. I cracked my knuckles and began to work. If Bradley wanted to play the role of a successful tech CEO, I was going to look under the hood of his precious startup. He called his company NovaStream. For the past year, he had paraded that name around my house like it was the next big thing in Silicon Valley. He bragged about user acquisition and synergy and disruptive technology. But numbers do not care about buzzwords. Numbers do not lie. I opened a series of secure databases that most civilians do not even know exist. I started with the basics. I pulled the Articles of Incorporation from the Delaware Division of Corporations. Delaware is where people incorporate when they want to hide who really owns the company. But I know how to peel back those layers. I traced the registered agent to a cheap mail forwarding service. That was the first red flag. A legitimate company seeking $2 million in seed funding does not use a $50 a month virtual mailbox. Next, I dug into the public financial filings. Bradley had claimed NovaStream was valued at $10 million. I ran a quick cross-reference on his early-stage investors. The money he had raised previously was not from venture capitalists. It was from his wealthy parents and a few gullible college fraternity brothers. The operating capital was burning faster than a dry forest in summer. He was spending thousands of dollars a month on luxury client dinners, expensive suits, and leasing a sleek office space downtown that he rarely visited. He was bleeding cash. The company had zero proprietary software. They were basically white-labeling an existing product and slapping a new logo on it. NovaStream was not a tech startup. It was an illusion. It was a house of cards built on arrogance, and my daughter was standing right in the middle of it. I leaned back in the plush leather chair and took a sip of my water. Finding out that my son-in-law was a fraud was not surprising. I had suspected as much for months. But being a bad businessman is not a crime. Being a liar to your investors is a civil matter. I needed something more. I needed the kill shot. I needed to find out why he was so desperate to impress those specific investors tonight in my specific house. Why did he need them to believe the Buckhead mansion was his own property? I cracked my neck and dove deeper into the digital paper trail. I shifted my focus from his corporate filings to his personal financial records. As a licensed investigator, I have access to sophisticated credit reporting algorithms. I ran a soft inquiry on his public debt profile. What I found made my blood run cold. Bradley was completely maxed out. Every single credit card in his name was stretched to the limit. But that was not the anomaly. The anomaly was a massive corporate line of credit that had been opened exactly 3 months ago. The amount was for $1.5 million. A bank does not simply hand over $1.5 million to a failing startup without serious collateral. And Bradley had no assets. He owned no property. His car was leased. His bank accounts were nearly empty. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I traced the origin of that specific commercial loan. The lender was a predatory private equity firm known for exorbitant interest rates and aggressive collection tactics. I hacked through the public county records to find the collateral documentation tied to the loan. The screen loaded line by line. When the final document appeared, my breath hitched in my throat. I leaned closer to the glowing screen to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. There, in black and white, was the address of my home. My $2.5 million estate in Buckhead had been listed as the primary physical collateral for Bradley and his failing company. My mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. I owned the house outright. My name was the only name on the deed. Bradley could not possibly use my house as collateral without my signature. I pulled up the digital copy of the loan agreement and scrolled down to the guarantor section. There were 2 signatures on the bottom line. One belonged to Bradley. The other signature belonged to my daughter, Nia. I felt a sharp physical pain in my chest. It was worse than the rain, worse than being kicked out, worse than the humiliation. Nia had signed the document. But as I zoomed in on the signature, my trained eye caught something crucial. I have studied handwriting analysis for decades. I know every loop and slant of my daughter's handwriting. I taught her how to write her name when she was 5 years old. The signature on the loan document was a forgery. The pressure of the pen strokes the angle of the letters. It was all wrong. It was a very good copy, but it was still a copy. Nia had not signed this paper. Bradley had forged his own wife's signature to bypass the banking regulations. He had committed felony wire fraud and mortgage fraud. He had used my home address claiming Nia had an ownership stake to secure a massive loan to keep his fake company afloat. And now he was hosting new investors in my dining room, trying to secure another $2 million to pay off the first predatory loan before it defaulted. If he defaulted, the private equity firm could legally attempt to place a lien on my property. They would fail eventually because my name was on the true deed, but the legal battle would be exhausting and expensive. Bradley had not just disrespected me, he had weaponized my home and criminalized my daughter. He forged her name, making her an unwitting accomplice to a federal crime. If the FBI ever looked into NovaStream, Nia would be the first person they dragged away in handcuffs because her name was on the fraudulent documents. He was willing to let his own wife go to federal prison just to maintain his lifestyle. I closed the loan document. The rhythmic tapping of the rain against the hotel window was the only sound in the suite. I did not feel sad anymore. The mother in me, the woman who had welcomed him into my home, the woman who had tried to keep the peace for the sake of her daughter, she was dead. She died the moment I saw that forged signature. Bradley thought he was a smart tech entrepreneur playing the system. He thought he was playing me. He did not realize he had just invited a master-level chess player to a game of checkers. I picked up my phone. It was past midnight, but my attorney Marcus never sleeps. He is a shark in a tailored suit, a man who enjoys destroying lives in the courtroom as much as I enjoy finding the hidden numbers. I dialed his private number. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of all warmth. "I hope you are awake. I have a new project for you. Tell me everything, Maxine." He replied, his voice low and attentive. I looked out the window at the dark city. Bradley changed the rules of engagement, Marcus. He did not just kick me out of my house. He committed federal wire fraud, and he forged Nia's signature to do it. He used my property as collateral for a commercial loan. I heard the scratch of a pen on paper through the phone. Marcus was already taking notes. "That is a minimum 10-year sentence in federal lockup," he said calmly. "How do you want to handle this, Maxine? Do we go straight to the authorities in the morning?" I smiled. It was a terrifying smile in the reflection of the glass. "No," I replied softly. "Going to the authorities now is too quick. It is too merciful. I want him to believe he has won. I want him to climb as high as he possibly can so the fall destroys him completely. I want you to trigger the ironclad clause on the property deed first. Then we are going to let him host his little events. We are going to let him bring in his new investors. We are going to build an airtight case that even a high-priced corporate lawyer cannot unravel." "Understood," Marcus said. "What about Nia? I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing my daughter sitting at the table drinking wine while I was thrown into the rain. "She made her choice tonight," I said softly. "She chose her husband over her mother. Now she has to survive the storm he created." I hung up the phone and closed the laptop. The suite was quiet and warm. Bradley had sent me away thinking I would cower in a cheap motel and beg for my daughter to let me back in. Instead, he had given me the perfect quiet luxury of a 5-star hotel room to meticulously orchestrate his absolute and total destruction. He wanted to be the man of the house. By tomorrow afternoon, I was going to make sure he did not even own the clothes on his back. The afternoon sun was shining brightly over the manicured lawns of my Buckhead neighborhood as my private driver pulled up to the sweeping driveway of my estate. The brutal rainstorm from the previous night had completely washed away, leaving the sky a crisp and brilliant blue. It was a stark contrast to the dark reality I was returning to. I instructed the driver to wait by the curb. I stepped out of the black town car, wearing a fresh, impeccably tailored pearl-white suit that the hotel concierge had acquired for me that morning. I walked up the long slate pathway leading to my solid oak front door. The house looked exactly as I had left it. The towering white pillars stood proud, and the large windows reflected the afternoon light. It was my castle. It was the physical manifestation of my life work. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my heavy brass key. I inserted the key into the traditional deadbolt lock above the sleek modern keypad I had installed 2 years ago. The key slid in, but it refused to turn. I frowned slightly and jiggled the metal, but the cylinder was completely rigid. I pulled the key out and looked at the smart lock below it. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The small LED ring flashed a harsh, solid red. Access denied. I entered my 6-digit master PIN code onto the glass keypad. The red light flashed again, followed by a sharp negative beep. Access denied. The entire locking mechanism had been completely replaced and reprogrammed. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of being locked out of my own $2.5 million home, a small chime echoed from the smart doorbell camera mounted on the brick wall to my right. The blue light spun, and a tinny, distorted voice crackled through the small speaker. "Hello," Maxine Bradley said through the device. His voice was laced with a thick layer of condescension and forced corporate authority. "I see you made it back from your little hotel stay." I stepped back and looked directly into the tiny camera lens. My face remained an unreadable mask. "Open the door, Bradley," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. There was a brief pause followed by a heavy sigh from the speaker, as if I was a nuisance he had to manage. "I cannot do that right now, Maxine," he replied. "I had the security company come out first thing this morning to upgrade the entire perimeter system. For security reasons due to my company intellectual property, you need to knock from now on. We have highly sensitive proprietary software being developed in the home office now, and my investors require strict access control protocols." I stared at the small black camera lens. Proprietary software. Intellectual property. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I had spent the entire night tearing through his hidden financial records. I knew with absolute certainty that his so-called intellectual property was nothing more than a white-labeled template he bought online for $300. He had no code, he had no software, he had a fake company, a maxed-out fraudulent line of credit, and a forged deed with my daughter's signature on it. He was using imaginary corporate espionage as an excuse to lock a black woman out of the house she bought with cold, hard cash. I did not yell at the camera. I did not demand my rights. I stood there in the warm afternoon sun, waiting for his next move. The heavy oak door finally clicked and swung open. But it was not Bradley standing in the foyer. It was Nia. My 32-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance with her body. She was wearing a pair of expensive designer yoga pants and a cashmere sweater that I had purchased for her last Christmas. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her jaw was set in a defensive posture. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her posture lacked the confident grace I had spent decades trying to instill in her. "Mom, please do not start a fight today," Nia said, before I could even speak a single word. Her voice was trembling slightly, but her eyes were hard and unforgiving. I looked at my only child. I looked at the little girl I had raised by myself after her father passed away. The girl I had protected and provided for with every ounce of my strength. "I am locked out of my own house, Nia," I stated simply, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Your husband changed the locks on my front door." Nia shifted her weight and looked away from my gaze, staring out at the expansive front lawn instead. "Bradley is under a lot of pressure right now, Mom," she said, reciting the excuse like a rehearsed script. "The investor dinner went really well last night, but he has to meet strict security compliance standards to get the final check. You walking in and out whenever you please is a liability. You need to stop making everything about you all the time. This is our house too now, and you have to respect our boundaries." The air between us grew freezing cold despite the afternoon sun. "Stop making everything about me. This is our house too now." The words echoed in my mind, twisting like a jagged knife. I searched her face for any sign of the intelligent, independent woman I thought I had raised. I looked for a hint of remorse for letting me walk out into the pouring rain the night before. I looked for a shadow of guilt for the $1.5 million fraudulent loan bearing her forged signature. There was nothing. There was only the desperate, blind loyalty of a woman who had completely surrendered her identity to a mediocre man. "Do you truly believe this is your house, Nia?" I asked softly. My voice was so quiet it barely carried over the gentle rustling of the oak trees in the front yard. She snapped her attention back to me, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. "Yes, Mom, it is," she shot back, her voice rising in volume. "Bradley and I are building a future here. We are a family. You cannot just control everything with your money forever. You need to step back and let him be the head of this household. If you are going to live here, you have to follow his rules." I felt a profound shift deep within my soul. The final tether of maternal protection snapped. I had spent the last 12 hours trying to find a way to destroy him without completely destroying her. I had hoped against hope that she was an innocent victim manipulated and coerced into his web of financial deceit. But standing here looking at her defend the very man who had forged her name on federal bank documents, I realized the devastating truth. She was not a victim. She was a willing participant in my erasure. She had chosen her side of the battlefield. During my 35 years in the field of forensic accounting, I have seen every conceivable form of betrayal. I have watched business partners steal millions from each other with a smile. I have seen siblings drain family trusts, leaving their own blood relatives in absolute ruin. I have testified in federal court against executives who sold out their employees just to buy a third yacht. I thought nothing could ever shock me again. I thought my heart had been hardened against the deceptive nature of human beings. But standing on my own porch, looking into the cold eyes of my only child, I felt a pain that no corporate case had ever prepared me for. Nia was not just protecting her husband. She was actively participating in the theft of my legacy. The estate I had built from the ground up, the wealth I had accumulated through decades of grueling work, and the home I had purchased to secure our family future meant nothing to her compared to the illusion of his success. I realized then that my daughter had completely internalized his entitlement. She believed that because I loved her, I would simply absorb the abuse indefinitely. She believed my silence the previous night was a sign of submission rather than a tactical retreat. They both mistook my calm demeanor for weakness. They had no idea that a silent accountant is the most dangerous entity in the room because the numbers never sleep and the documents never lie. I had the fraudulent loan agreement printed out and securely locked in the safe at my hotel suite. I had the forged signature analyzed and documented by my private server algorithms. I had the entire history of his empty shell company mapped out like a battle strategy. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for entry into a home that I already owned on paper and in reality. I did not try to reason with her. I did not mention the forged documents, the crushing debt, or the predatory private equity firm that now held a lien against the very ground she was standing on. Providing her with logic would only give her the opportunity to warn him. And I needed Bradley to feel completely safe and unchallenged until the trap snapped shut. I said my voice devoid of all warmth and motherly affection. "I understand perfectly, Nia. She looked slightly confused by my lack of resistance. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and she took a small step back into the foyer. "So you will agree to knock from now on?" she asked hesitantly. I looked past her into the grand hallway. I saw the custom marble floors I had paid for. I saw the crystal chandelier I had imported from Italy. Then I looked back at her face. "I will not be knocking, Nia," I replied calmly. "Enjoy the house." Without waiting for her response, I turned my back on my daughter and walked away from the front door. I heard her call out my name once, but I did not stop. I did not turn around. My heels clicked rhythmically against the slate pathway, a steady metallic beat of absolute finality. I walked past the manicured hedges and the blooming rose bushes I had planted with my own 2 hands. I reached the waiting town car, and the driver quickly opened the rear passenger door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat and instructed him to drive me back to the hotel. As the car pulled away from the curb, I rolled down the tinted window and looked back at the sprawling estate one last time. Nia was still standing in the doorway watching me leave. Bradley had stepped out from the shadows of the hallway to stand right beside her, placing a possessive arm around her shoulders. They looked like the perfect young couple standing in their perfect mansion. It was a beautiful illusion, and I was going to burn it to the ground. I rolled the window back up, enclosing myself in the quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my contacts and dialed the direct private line for my attorney, Marcus. He answered on the very first ring. Maxine Marcus said, his voice sharp and professional. "Did you get inside?" "No, Marcus," I replied, my voice completely steady and cold as ice. He changed the locks. He claimed it was for corporate security protocols. And Nia stood right next to him and told me I needed to respect their boundaries. There was a low chuckle on the other end of the line. "Well then," Marcus said, "he has officially locked the legal owner out of the primary residence. That changes the timeline significantly. How do you want to proceed?" I looked at my reflection in the dark tinted glass of the car window. The woman looking back at me was no longer a mother or a mother-in-law. She was a predator who had just locked onto her prey. I leaned back into the soft leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. "Marcus," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "It is time to trigger the ironclad clause. Prepare the eviction notices, prepare the fraud dossiers, and freeze every single asset tied to that property. Let the war begin." The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite at the Four Seasons. I woke up feeling rested and completely at peace. There was no rushing, no loud voices, and no arrogant son-in-law trying to dictate my movements. I ordered a lavish breakfast from room service and ate it slowly while reviewing the financial files on my encrypted laptop. Marcus was already preparing the legal documents to freeze the assets, but I knew Bradley would not just sit quietly. A man like him always doubles down when he believes he has the upper hand. Instead of fighting him over the changed smart locks, I chose to stay in my luxurious hotel room. I knew my silence would make him feel invincible. He would interpret my absence as a total surrender. Arrogant men always mistake strategic patience for feminine weakness. He thought he had successfully intimidated a defenseless older black woman into submission. He assumed I was currently sitting in some cheap motel room crying over my lost family and my stolen house. He was terribly wrong, but I needed him to feel completely secure, so he would make his next monumental legal mistake soon. That mistake arrived at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was reviewing the fraudulent corporate line of credit when someone knocked on the heavy wooden door of my suite. I closed the laptop screen and walked over to the door. I looked through the brass peephole, expecting to see a hotel staff member bringing fresh towels. Instead, I saw a middle-aged white woman standing in the hallway. She was wearing a beige trench coat and holding a thick manila folder clutched tightly to her chest. She looked official and very serious, so I opened the door for her. "Good afternoon," the woman said, holding up a silver badge attached to a lanyard around her neck. "My name is Susan Collins, and I am an investigator with Adult Protective Services for Fulton County. I am looking for Maxine." I stared at the silver badge for a brief moment before meeting her eyes. "I am Maxine," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and polite. The woman looked genuinely surprised to see me standing there, looking perfectly healthy and composed in my expensive silk clothing. She glanced down at the open file folder in her hands and frowned in confusion. "May I come in and speak with you, Maxine?" she asked with a cautious tone. "We received a highly concerning emergency report this morning regarding your mental health and physical safety." I stepped aside and gestured for her to enter the sprawling suite. "Please come in, Susan," I said smoothly. "Would you like a cup of hot tea or perhaps some sparkling water?" She stepped into the luxurious room, and her eyes widened slightly as she took in the panoramic views and the elegant furnishings. This was clearly not the setting she expected for an abused elder patient at all. Susan sat down at the heavy oak dining table while I poured us both a cup of Earl Grey tea from the silver pot. I handed her a delicate porcelain cup and sat down directly across from her. "Who filed the emergency report, Susan?" I asked, before taking a slow sip. She hesitated for a second before answering. "The report was filed by your son-in-law, Bradley," she explained. "He claimed that you are suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia. He stated that you wandered out of your house last night into a terrible rainstorm completely disoriented and confused." I placed my teacup gently on the matching saucer. Bradley was truly a special kind of evil. He was weaponizing the very night he kicked me out of my own home into a rainstorm to build a fraudulent medical profile against me. Why would he file such a report? I asked, feigning mild confusion to see what else he had told her. Susan sighed and opened her manila folder. "He told our agency that he needs immediate legal power of attorney over your estate and medical decisions to protect you from harming yourself and losing your valuable financial assets today. He claimed you were making erratic choices and throwing away money on expensive hotel rooms," she continued. "He specifically provided this hotel address as proof of your declining mental state. He said you needed to be placed in an assisted living facility immediately for your own good." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The absolute nerve of that little boy. He was trying to lock me in a nursing home and steal my entire fortune using a fake dementia diagnosis. He thought the state would simply take his word because he was an articulate young white tech entrepreneur. Right? "I understand, Susan," I said, folding my hands neatly on the table. "What is the standard procedure for this type of investigation?" Susan pulled a pen from her pocket. "I need to ask you a series of standard cognitive questions, Maxine. It is called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It tests your memory, attention, and orientation." I nodded gracefully and told her to proceed. She asked me to identify the current date, the exact location, and the season. I answered effortlessly. Then she gave me 5 random words to remember and repeat back to her at a much later time today. The words were velvet church, daisy red, and banana. We moved on to basic mathematics. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I did it faster than she could write the numbers down. "I am a retired forensic accountant. Susan," I mentioned casually as I reached 938679. "Numbers are my primary language." She smiled warmly, completely dropping her defensive investigator posture. "You are incredibly sharp, Maxine," she admitted. "It is abundantly clear to me that you do not have any signs of cognitive decline or dementia whatsoever at all right now." I repeated the 5 random words back to her perfectly without being prompted. Velvet church, daisy, red, and banana. Susan closed her file and shook her head in disbelief. "I have to say I am very confused," she confessed. "Why would your son-in-law make such a serious and easily disprovable accusation? Filing a false report with Adult Protective Services is a very serious offense. It wastes valuable state resources and traumatizes innocent families." I stood up slowly from the dining table and walked over to my heavy laptop bag, resting on the nearby luxury leather sofa right there. I pulled out a thick, pristine white binder that Marcus had delivered to me earlier that morning. It was filled with highlighted documents, bank statements, and property records. I brought the binder back to the table and placed it squarely in front of the social worker. "Bradley filed that false report because he is desperate, Susan," I explained. "He did not kick me out of my house because I was wandering or confused. He kicked me out because he is currently committing federal wire fraud, and he needs complete control over my physical property to finalize the entire financial theft." Susan opened the binder tentatively. I walked her through the evidence page by page, just as I had done 1,000 times before in federal courtrooms. I showed her the fraudulent $1.5 million corporate loan. I showed her the maxed-out personal credit cards. I pointed out the fake template company he was pretending to run. Then I turned to the final page and showed her the forged signature of my daughter Nia on the collateral agreement. He forged my daughter's name to secure a predatory loan against my estate, I stated with absolute coldness and anger. Susan gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes darted across the documents, recognizing the undeniable truth laid out before her. He wanted to get legal power of attorney over me today so he could quietly transfer the deed of my house into his name before the private equity firm foreclosed on the property. I continued. He thought he could use your agency to declare me incompetent and silence me forever. He tried to turn you into a weapon against a black senior citizen just to hide his own massive financial failures. It is completely disgusting behavior entirely. The social worker sat back in her chair, looking visibly shaken by the sheer magnitude of the deception. "I am so terribly sorry, Maxine," she whispered. "I had no idea we were being used to facilitate a major financial crime. I will close this medical investigation immediately and clear your name in our system." I smiled warmly and reached across the table to gently pat her hand. "Thank you, Susan," I said. "But I need to ask a favor of you. I am preparing a massive legal strike against him. Will you be a sworn witness for me in court?" Sunday afternoon arrived with a gentle breeze that swept through the vibrant green canopy of my Buckhead neighborhood. I instructed my private driver to take me back to my estate. I had not informed Bradley or my daughter Nia that I was coming back today. I knew from checking our shared digital family calendar that Bradley was hosting a lavish Sunday barbecue in my backyard. He was celebrating his imagined victory over me. When the black town car pulled up to the curb, I could already smell the expensive brisket smoking on my custom-built outdoor grill. I stepped out of the car, wearing a flowing emerald green silk dress and oversized designer sunglasses. I looked every bit the wealthy matriarch that I truly am. I walked right past the locked front door and followed the sound of obnoxious, loud laughter coming from the side gate. I pushed the heavy wooden gate open and stepped into my own backyard. The scene before me was a perfectly curated illusion of white corporate success built entirely on the stolen wealth of a hard-working black woman. There were about 30 people scattered across my sprawling manicured lawn. Most of them were white tech developers and junior investors holding expensive craft beers and laughing entirely too loud. Bradley stood by the massive stone grill wearing a ridiculous floral apron over his designer polo shirt. He was holding a pair of silver tongs and pointing them at people as he told exaggerated stories about his non-existent business acumen. Nia was hovering nearby, holding a silver tray of appetizers. She looked like a nervous servant, trying desperately to impress his colleagues and his arrogant family. I stood quietly near the blooming hydrangea bushes, just observing them for a moment. Nobody noticed me at first. I took in the extravagant decorations and the expensive catered side dishes from a high-end local restaurant. Bradley was spending money he absolutely did not have to impress people who did not actually care about him. He was completely unaware that his fake Adult Protective Services report had been thrown in the garbage. He had no idea that Susan, the social worker, was now my star witness for his upcoming federal fraud trial. Then I spotted them sitting comfortably under my shaded patio pavilion. Bradley's parents, Richard and Eleanor, were holding court. They were the absolute epitome of arrogant old money, except they had squandered most of their actual wealth many years ago. They lived entirely on massive credit card debt and fading country club prestige. Richard was smoking a thick Cuban cigar and swirling a glass of my late husband's rare vintage bourbon. Eleanor was sitting in my favorite wicker chair, wearing a beige linen suit and a perpetual look of polite disgust. They had always looked down on me and Nia. They tolerated our presence only because I had money and because Nia was beautiful enough to look good on Bradley's arm. I walked slowly across the freshly cut grass, moving with the silent grace of a panther stalking its prey. As I approached the patio, Eleanor finally noticed my presence. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she plastered a fake, tight smile across her thin, wrinkled face. "Maxine." she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We certainly did not expect to see you here today." I stepped under the cooling shade of the pavilion and slowly removed my sunglasses. "Hello, Eleanor," I said smoothly. "It is a beautiful Sunday to be in my own backyard, do you not agree?" She deliberately ignored my subtle emphasis on ownership and let out a dry little laugh. "Well, we are just so incredibly proud of Bradley today," she declared loudly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear her words. "He has been working so incredibly hard on his new tech company, and he is doing such a wonderful job providing a beautiful life for Nia." She took a slow sip of her sparkling water and looked around the expansive estate with a deeply condescending smirk. "You know, Maxine, it is just so nice of Bradley to take care of you and Nia in a neighborhood exactly like this one. It is truly a blessing that he could step up and be the man of the house, especially for people coming from your particular urban background." The blatant racist microaggression hung heavy in the warm summer air. She was loudly implying that a black woman could never afford a mansion in Buckhead without the benevolent rescue of her mediocre white son. I did not flinch at all. I did not raise my voice or react to the disgusting racial insult. I simply looked at Eleanor with a gaze so cold and piercing that her fake smile began to tremble noticeably. I let the silence stretch for an uncomfortable amount of time, making her squirm in her seat. "People from my background understand the true value of hard work, Eleanor," I replied softly. "We also understand that empty barrels always make the most noise." Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson, but she could not think of a clever response to save her pride. Before she could even try, Bradley suddenly appeared right beside us. He smelled like heavy barbecue smoke and cheap designer cologne. His eyes darted nervously between me and his mother. He clearly had not expected me to show up and completely ruin his perfect false narrative. "Maxine," he said, forcing a jovial tone for his parents to hear, "I am so glad you decided to drop by today. We need to have a quick family chat right now. Why do we not step into the study for a minute, just you and me?" I nodded slowly and followed him through the large sliding glass doors into the main house. We walked silently down the hallway and stepped into my private study. The quiet room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with my complex accounting ledgers and heavy legal texts. Bradley firmly closed the heavy oak door behind us, completely shutting out the loud noise of the barbecue outside. The moment the door clicked shut, his fake friendly smile vanished completely. "What exactly are you doing here?" he hissed angrily. "I told you, very clearly, not to come back until tomorrow afternoon. You are completely ruining the vibe with my parents and my most important investors." I walked casually over to my mahogany desk and ran my hand along the polished wood surface. "I came here to enjoy a beautiful Sunday afternoon at my own house, Bradley," I said calmly. "Is there some kind of problem with that?" He crossed his arms tightly over his chest and glared at me with pure hatred. "Yes, there is a massive problem," he snapped rudely. "You cannot just wander in and out of here anymore. You are not well, Maxine." He reached deep into the pocket of his greasy floral apron and pulled out a glossy trifold printed brochure. He tossed it carelessly onto the center of my clean mahogany desk. I looked down at the paper. The front cover featured a stock picture of smiling elderly people sitting in wheelchairs looking happily at a flower garden. It was a promotional brochure for Shady Pines, a high-end assisted living facility located 2 hours outside of the city limits. "I have been talking to some leading medical professionals lately," Bradley lied smoothly without ever breaking eye contact with me. "We all completely agree that your mental health is declining very rapidly. You wandering out into the pouring rain the other night proved that you are a serious danger to yourself. You need strict round-the-clock medical care that Nia and I simply cannot provide while we are actively running a major tech corporation from this house." I picked up the glossy brochure and examined it very carefully. He really thought his fake Adult Protective Services report was actually going to work. He truly believed he had successfully trapped me. "I am extremely willing to be generous with you, Maxine." He continued, his tone shifting to one of false magnanimity and arrogant pity. "I know you do not have much money saved up since your husband Marcus died a few years ago, So I am offering to pay for this facility completely out of my own pocket. I will personally give you $2,000 every single month to cover your room and board at Shady Pines. All you have to do is sign over your medical and financial power of attorney to me today. It will make things so much easier and safer for everyone involved. You can go live quietly in the country, and Nia and I can finally have the physical space we need to grow our family wealth in peace. I stared at him while listening to the sheer absolute delusion spilling from his mouth. He was confidently offering me $2,000 of my own stolen money to banish me to a rural nursing home so he could finally steal my $2.5 million house without any legal interruptions. He stood there waiting for me to break down in tears and gratefully accept his pathetic, insulting offer. He expected me to surrender my entire life to him right then and there. I looked down at the Shady Pines brochure in my hand and then looked back up into his arrogant blue eyes. I did not scream or throw the paper in his face. Instead, I calmly folded the glossy brochure and extended my arm to hand it directly back to him. I smiled my coldest, most calculated smile. "You should hold on to this, Bradley," I said softly, letting my words slice through the quiet air of the study like a razor blade. "Someone in this family will be needing state housing very soon." His confident smirk faltered slightly as confusion briefly washed over his face. He had absolutely no idea that I had already legally frozen all of his bank accounts. He had no idea that the federal authorities were already building a massive criminal fraud case against him. He just stood there holding the brochure, completely unaware that he had just dug his own grave so deep he would never ever see the sun again. The destruction of his fake empire was coming, and I was going to enjoy watching every single second of his spectacular downfall in my house. Monday morning arrived with a crispness that matched my absolute focus. The sun was shining brightly over the city skyline, reflecting my clear intentions. Bradley felt incredibly invincible after his little Sunday barbecue. He genuinely believed his fake Adult Protective Services report was currently being processed by the state authorities today. He thought I was quietly waiting to be hauled away to an assisted living facility. His sheer arrogance blinded him to the massive legal storm gathering right above his head. I woke up early in my hotel suite and dressed in a sharp charcoal gray business suit, pairing it with my favorite pearl necklace. I looked exactly like the seasoned forensic accountant I truly am. My attorney Marcus had already laid the necessary legal groundwork. Now it was my turn to execute the next phase of his destruction perfectly and without any mercy. I knew from intercepting his digital calendar that Bradley had a very important appointment scheduled for 10 o'clock. He was heading down to the main downtown branch of First Metropolitan Bank to finalize a $1 million commercial loan. Bradley walked quickly through the heavy revolving glass doors, wearing a bespoke navy suit he could not actually afford to buy. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the forged documents he had spent the last week creating. He approached the reception desk with the unearned confidence of a mediocre man who had never faced a single consequence. He was quickly escorted into a private glass-walled conference room to meet a junior loan officer named David. Bradley confidently opened his briefcase and slid a thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table. These were the fraudulent documents claiming I had willingly transferred the deed of my Buckhead estate into a fake entity called the Nova Stream Executive Trust. Bradley named himself the sole executor. He smiled his signature arrogant smile and told the junior officer he needed the funds expedited immediately. David, the loan officer, carefully reviewed the paperwork. He examined the forged signature that supposedly belonged to me and the fake notary stamps Bradley illegally purchased online. David nodded politely and gathered the documents. He told Bradley everything looked in order, but he needed to take the file to the branch vice president for final signature and funds disbursement. Bradley leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his legs comfortably. He felt like an absolute genius. He thought he successfully stole my legacy and secured his fake fortune. David stood up and walked out, closing the heavy glass door securely. Bradley sat alone, checking his reflection in his dark phone screen. He waited completely unaware his entire pathetic world was about to collapse on top of him. The brass handle of the door finally turned. Bradley sat up straight, expecting the junior loan officer to return with a massive check. But the door opened wide, and David did not walk back inside. Instead, a tall, distinguished young black man in an immaculate tailored suit stepped into the room. His name was Julian, and he was the senior vice president of the bank. He was also a brilliant young man I personally mentored 10 years ago when he was just a struggling college intern trying to break into the financial sector. I taught Julian everything he knew about detecting corporate fraud. Stepping into the room right behind Julian was me. I walked in slowly with my head held high. Bradley's confident smile vanished instantly. His face went entirely pale, and his jaw dropped slightly. He looked back and forth between me and Julian in absolute shock. He could not comprehend how the elderly woman he kicked out into the rain was standing inside a secure banking facility next to the highest executive. "Maxine," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting." He tried to stand up, but his legs lacked strength. I did not say a single word. I simply pulled out the chair directly across from him and sat down, folding my hands neatly on the table. Julian remained standing, placing the forged documents right in the center of the table. "Good morning, Bradley." Julian said, his voice devoid of any professional warmth. "I am Julian, the senior vice president of this branch. I just finished reviewing your loan application and the accompanying property deed transfer documents." Bradley swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "Is there a problem?" he asked nervously, trying to sound authoritative. "Yes, there is a very significant problem," Julian replied smoothly. "The property you are attempting to use as collateral is solely owned by the woman sitting right across from you. She personally informed me she never signed these transfer documents. In fact, our fraud department already verified the notary stamps on these papers are completely counterfeit." Bradley panicked. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating the distance to his freedom. "This is just a massive misunderstanding," he lied quickly, reaching out to grab the papers. "My mother-in-law suffers from severe dementia. She does not remember signing the trust documents. I need those papers back right now so we can go to a different bank." Julian calmly placed his hand firmly over the documents, preventing Bradley from taking them. "You will not take these anywhere," Bradley Julian stated. "As a federally insured institution, we are legally required to retain all forged documents as evidence. These papers will be handed directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the security camera footage today." Bradley realized he was trapped. The arrogant tech bro facade completely melted away, leaving only a terrified little boy facing real consequences for the first time. He looked at me, pleading for mercy. "Maxine, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "Tell him this is a mistake. If they call the federal authorities, my entire life will be ruined. My company will be destroyed. Naya will be absolutely devastated. You cannot do this to your own daughter." He was actually trying to use my daughter as a human shield to protect himself from federal prison. It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. I looked at him with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. I did not yell or raise my voice. True power never needs to scream. "You ruined your own life, Bradley," I said softly, slicing through his panic like a scalpel. "You forged my signature today, and you forged my daughter's signature 3 months ago to secure that massive predatory line of credit. You thought you could steal my home and lock me in a rural facility with a fake medical diagnosis. You thought I was an ignorant old woman you could manipulate, but you made the fatal mistake of picking a fight with a master forensic accountant." "Julian," I said calmly. "Proceed with the internal asset protocol, please." Julian tapped a few buttons on his tablet. "It is done, Maxine," Julian confirmed. Bradley looked incredibly confused. "What is done?" he asked, barely a whisper. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "As the verified victim of your documented financial fraud, I officially requested a total bank-wide freeze," I explained slowly. "Every account you hold at First Metropolitan Bank is now completely locked. Your personal checking account is frozen. Your fake business accounts are frozen." Bradley's eyes widened in sheer absolute horror. "You cannot do that," he gasped, clutching his chest. "My payroll runs tomorrow. I have vendors to pay. Nia and I need that money to buy groceries. You are leaving us with absolutely nothing." I tilted my head slightly, observing his suffering with immense clinical satisfaction. "Yes, Bradley," I replied smoothly. "I am leaving you with absolutely nothing. You locked me out of my own house yesterday afternoon. So today I am locking you out of the entire banking system. And because your wife willingly signed her name onto your joint accounts, those assets are entirely frozen as well. She chose to stand by a thief, so she gets to experience the crushing poverty of a thief. Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. He grabbed his empty briefcase with shaking hands. He practically ran toward the glass door, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of his total financial ruin. Before he could push the door open, my voice stopped him dead in his tracks. "By the way, Bradley," I called out softly, "you might want to call an Uber to get home, since you used your frozen checking account to set up the auto pay for your luxury car lease. The dealership was notified of your fraudulent status this morning. They are repossessing your vehicle from the bank parking lot right now." He did not even turn around. He pushed through this glass door and stumbled out into the main lobby, completely broken and defeated. I sat in the quiet conference room and took a deep breath. Julian smiled and offered to buy me a cup of premium coffee to celebrate. I accepted his offer, knowing we won. Bradley walked into the bank feeling like a king, ready to conquer the world and steal my entire life without a second thought. He walked out a penniless criminal with the federal authorities breathing heavily down his neck and absolutely nowhere left to hide. The destruction was beautiful, and I was only just getting started. Tuesday afternoon was exceptionally warm and bright in Atlanta. My daughter Nia was completely oblivious to the massive financial avalanche that had just buried her husband earlier that morning. She was living in her carefully constructed bubble of false luxury. She drove her leased luxury sport utility vehicle to an upscale shopping mall to purchase a new designer outfit. Bradley was hosting a massive launch party for his fake company later that week, and Nia wanted to look like the perfect wealthy tech wife. She walked into an exclusive European boutique and selected a custom silk gown that cost nearly $4,000. She carried the heavy garment bag to the marble checkout counter with complete confidence. The sales associate smiled politely and folded the dress into a pristine white shopping bag. Nia handed over her platinum credit card without a second thought. She expected the transaction to be completely seamless, just like every other aspect of her sheltered life. The sales associate slid the card through the sleek black machine. The machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red error message. The associate frowned slightly and tried the card again. The same loud negative beep echoed through the quiet luxury boutique. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the associate whispered discreetly. "Your card has been declined by the bank." Nia let out a small, annoyed sigh. She assumed it was just a random security hold because of the large purchase amount. She reached into her designer leather wallet and pulled out a different gold credit card. This account was tied directly to Bradley's primary business fund. She handed it to the cashier with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Try this one," she demanded confidently. The associate swiped the gold card. The machine beeped again, flashing another red error message. Declined. Nia felt a sudden hot flush of deep embarrassment creeping up her neck. Several other wealthy shoppers in the store were beginning to turn their heads and stare at her. She quickly pulled out a third card and then a fourth card. Every single card she presented was immediately rejected by the banking system. The sales associate looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "I am very sorry, ma'am, but every single account you have presented is currently frozen," the associate explained quietly. Nia snatched all of her useless plastic cards off the marble counter. Her face was burning with absolute humiliation. She muttered a quick excuse about a bank error and practically ran out of the boutique, leaving the beautiful silk gown sitting on the counter. She marched through the crowded luxury mall, feeling the heavy weight of public embarrassment crushing her chest. She climbed into her vehicle and slammed the door, completely shutting out the world. Her hands were shaking with pure anger. She pulled out her cell phone. She did not call her husband to ask what was wrong with their finances. She instantly knew exactly who was responsible for this massive inconvenience. She dialed my private number. I was sitting at the heavy oak table in my hotel suite, reviewing a stack of legal documents when my phone began to ring. I looked at the glowing screen and saw my daughter's name. I slowly picked up the phone and answered. "Hello, Nia," I said, my voice perfectly calm and collected. "You are an absolute monster!" Nia screamed into the phone before I could even finish my greeting. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with intense rage. "How could you possibly do this to us? I am sitting in the middle of a shopping mall, completely humiliated because every single bank account we have is completely frozen solid. You are a petty, bitter old woman trying to destroy my life just because you do not like my husband." I listened to her furious screaming without interrupting her. I let her exhaust her anger. "I am not the one who destroyed your finances, Nia," I replied softly but firmly. "Your husband is the one who caused this disaster. I simply notified the bank that he committed a major financial crime using my personal property." "That is a complete lie," Nia yelled back, her voice cracking with pure emotion. "Bradley told me exactly what you did at the bank this morning. He told me you showed up and caused a massive psychotic scene. He told me you used your old industry connections to illegally freeze his business accounts just to sabotage his big company launch party. You are so incredibly jealous of his success that you are willing to ruin his dreams and starve your own daughter to get your way." I closed my eyes and let out a long, heavy breath. Her absolute blind devotion to a criminal was staggering. She was choosing to believe the desperate lies of a man she had known for 3 years over the mother who had protected and provided for her for 32 years. "Nia, you need to listen to me very carefully right now," I said, dropping my voice to a deadly serious tone. "Bradley does not have a real company. He does not have any actual success. He is completely maxed out in debt. And worst of all, he forged your signature on a federal banking document 3 months ago to secure a $1.5 million commercial loan." The line went dead silent for a few seconds. I thought perhaps my words had finally pierced through her thick wall of delusion. I thought she was finally realizing the terrifying magnitude of the danger she was currently in. "You are totally insane," Nia finally whispered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Bradley would never, ever do something like that to me. He loves me. He is providing a beautiful life for us. You are just making up psychotic lies because you cannot handle the fact that I do not need your money or your control anymore. You are sick, Mom. You need serious psychiatric help. Bradley was completely right about you needing to be placed in a medical facility." "Nia," I pleaded, keeping my voice steady, despite the massive heartbreak shattering my chest. "I have the documents in my possession right now. I have the forensic proof. He used my house as collateral and he forged your name on the guarantor line. When the federal authorities come to investigate his company, they are going to arrest you too. You are legally tied to a massive federal wire fraud case. You need to pack your bags, leave that house, and come to my hotel right now so my lawyers can protect you from going to prison." "I do not want your fake protection," Nia snarled viciously, "and I never want to speak to you ever again. Do not call me. Do not come near our house. You are completely dead to me." She hung up the phone. The sharp click of the disconnected call echoed loudly in the quiet space of my luxurious hotel suite. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The silence in the room was completely deafening. I had spent my entire life building a massive empire of wealth and security specifically for her. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks analyzing fraudulent corporate tax returns, just so she would never have to worry about money. I had given her everything. I gave her an expensive education, a debt-free life, and unconditional maternal love. And she had just thrown it all completely away for a mediocre lying thief who was actively setting her up to take the fall for his massive federal crimes. A profound, heavy sadness washed over me. It was not the fast, hot pain of sudden betrayal. It was the slow, agonizing ache of watching someone you love willfully walk into a burning building and lock the door behind them. I could not save her. I could not force her to see the devastating truth she aggressively refused to acknowledge. She had made her ultimate choice. She chose the illusion of his white corporate success over the solid reality of my black maternal protection. She chose the toxic husband over the devoted mother. I slowly placed my cell phone down on the heavy oak dining table. I walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city looked beautiful and completely indifferent to the massive tragedy unfolding inside my broken family. I stood there for a long time, watching the tiny cars move along the busy highway below. I realized in that quiet moment that true power is not just about destroying your enemies. True power is having the absolute strength to let go of the people who refuse to be saved. If I kept trying to rescue her, she would simply drag me down into the dark federal abyss Bradley was creating. I could not allow that to happen. I had worked way too hard to build my legacy. I was not going to let a foolish, arrogant boy and a willfully blind girl destroy 35 years of immaculate financial success. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone again. I dialed the direct private number for my attorney, Marcus. He answered almost immediately. "Hello, Maxine Marcus," said his voice sharp and ready for instructions. "Did the bank freeze go through as planned today?" "Yes, Marcus," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "The accounts are completely frozen, but we have a new, extremely urgent priority right now. I need you to completely rewrite my estate planning documents immediately." Marcus paused for a brief second, sensing the heavy shift in my tone. "What exactly do you want to change, Maxine?" he asked carefully. "I am currently holding an estate valued at exactly $8 million, I explained smoothly. My daughter Nia is currently listed as the sole primary beneficiary of all my physical properties, liquid assets and corporate trust funds. I need you to remove her name from every single document. I am officially cutting her out of my entire will completely and permanently." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Marcus was a ruthless corporate lawyer, but even he was slightly shocked by the magnitude of this decision. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Maxine?" he asked quietly. "This is a very permanent, massive step. I am absolutely certain, Marcus," I stated firmly. "I just tried to warn her about the massive federal fraud. I offered to protect her from the upcoming criminal fallout. She called me a monster and told me she never wants to speak to me again. She has completely chosen her husband. If she wants to sink with his ship, I will let the water rise. Prepare the new legal paperwork right now." I sat back down in the plush leather chair and opened my encrypted laptop once again. There was still so much work left to do before the grand finale. Bradley was planning to host his massive fake launch party in my beautiful home later this week. He thought he was going to celebrate his ultimate victory. Instead, I was going to deliver a devastating legal nightmare. The trap was fully set and ready to snap shut forever. Wednesday morning began with a quiet intensity that only true preparation can bring. I left the Four Seasons Hotel and directed my driver to take me to the financial district of downtown Atlanta. I stepped into the towering glass skyscraper that housed the law offices of my attorney, Marcus. His firm occupied the entire top floor overlooking the bustling city below. I walked past the reception desk and went straight into his private corner office. Marcus was already sitting behind his massive mahogany desk with files spread out across the polished wood. We did not exchange pleasant greetings at all. We were two apex predators preparing for a massive hunt. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and placed my encrypted laptop on the table. The time for warnings had officially passed entirely. Bradley had locked me out of my home, and Nia had completely severed our relationship. We were no longer planning a simple civil eviction process. We were meticulously crafting a federal wire fraud and mortgage fraud case that would completely obliterate his entire existence. Marcus handed me a thick stack of printed documents. These were the finalized affidavits detailing his extensive criminal banking fraud. I read through every single line with absolute precision, ensuring every legal loophole was tightly closed shut forever. Bradley truly believed I was just an ignorant elderly widow who somehow stumbled into a fortune. He looked at my black skin and my graying hair and assumed I was a weak target he could easily manipulate without consequences. He never bothered to actually ask how I paid for a $2.5 million estate entirely in cash. If he had asked, he would have learned about my 35-year career as a highly successful, ruthless federal forensic financial accountant. I did not inherit my wealth through sheer luck. I built my empire by hunting down arrogant men exactly like him. For over 3 decades, I was hired by federal agencies to dismantle corrupt corporations and expose massive white-collar financial crimes. I spent my life tracking hidden offshore accounts, deciphering complex money laundering schemes, and testifying against powerful men in federal courtrooms. I have destroyed corrupt billionaires and sent arrogant executives to federal prison without ever breaking a sweat. I know exactly how criminals think because I have spent my entire adult life studying their complex behavioral patterns closely. Bradley was not a criminal mastermind at all. He was a sloppy, arrogant amateur who made the fatal mistake of trying to steal from a woman who literally wrote the manual on asset recovery. He picked the absolute worst prey in the entire world. Marcus and I spent the next several hours preparing the ultimate legal ambush. We were not going to simply mail him an eviction notice and wait 30 days. We were going to hit him with a coordinated multi-agency strike immediately. Marcus had already drafted the emergency injunction to have Bradley forcefully removed from my property. We cited severe financial elder abuse and active criminal fraud as the primary reasons for immediate extraction. But the physical eviction was just the opening act of the show. The main event was the thick federal dossier we were submitting directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We mapped out exactly how Bradley used the forged signature of his own wife to secure a $1.5 million line of credit. We documented how he illegally transferred the deed of my estate into his fake corporate trust just to secure business capital funding. We included the sworn testimony of Susan, the social worker, proving he filed a false medical report to silence his victim. Marcus looked at the massive pile of irrefutable evidence and shook his head in pure disbelief. He told me Bradley was looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I felt absolutely no sympathy for him. He dug the grave, and now he was going to sleep in it forever. While we finalized the criminal reports, Marcus shifted his attention to Bradley's upcoming business event that was happening very soon at my own house. Bradley was planning to host a massive launch party at my house on Friday night to secure his final round of investor funding. I told Marcus we needed to completely destroy his professional reputation right in front of his wealthy guests. We needed to know exactly who was planning to write him a $2 million check so we could intercept the funds and expose his fraud publicly. Marcus opened his laptop and hacked into the public records of the venture capital firms Bradley had been desperately courting for the past 6 months to find the main primary target quickly. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he traced the digital footprints of Bradley's recent corporate meetings and email communications. After a few minutes of intense searching, Marcus finally found the primary target. He turned his laptop screen around so I could see the information clearly. He told me Bradley had somehow managed to secure a massive series of funding agreement with a very exclusive private equity firm based in New York City. Marcus pointed to the bold logo on the screen and read the name of the company out very loud. The firm was formerly called Sterling Capital Incorporated. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the name Sterling Capital over and over again quietly. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face as the beautiful reality of the situation fully settled into my mind. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet office room. Marcus looked at me with deep confusion and concern. He asked me what was so incredibly funny about Sterling Capital being the primary investor. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my heavy silver business card holder from the bottom inside. I extracted a thick black card embossed with gold lettering and slid it across the mahogany desk toward Marcus. He picked it up and read the text silently. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he looked back up at me. I smiled at him and explained the beautiful irony of the situation clearly. 10 years ago, I helped the founders of Sterling Capital uncover a massive embezzlement scheme within their own ranks. In exchange for saving their company from total ruin, they offered me a permanent silent seat on their prestigious board of directors as a gesture of gratitude. I actually own a 12% stake in the exact company Bradley was currently begging for money. He was hosting a party in my house to celebrate stealing my money to impress a company that I secretly controlled from the shadows. The trap was absolutely perfect in every single way imaginable. I told Marcus to print the final eviction papers and notify the federal authorities about our timeline. I was going to personally attend that launch party and completely destroy his world. There would be absolutely no mercy shown to a man who tried to steal my entire legacy today. Marcus was absolutely brilliant in his legal execution. He immediately drafted a highly confidential message directly to the lead managing partner at Sterling Capital. He explained the entire situation regarding the fraudulent corporate loan and the forged property deed. He included the undeniable forensic proof that Bradley was running a completely fake tech startup. The managing partner was absolutely furious when he realized Bradley was attempting to defraud their prestigious firm using stolen assets. They agreed to play along with the scheme until the launch party. They wanted to witness the spectacular downfall of this arrogant tech bro personally, too. We meticulously reviewed every single piece of evidence one last time to ensure absolute perfection. The trap was incredibly sophisticated and completely inescapable. I felt a deep sense of righteous vindication washing over my soul as I looked at the final legal documents. Bradley had severely underestimated the raw power of a black woman who had spent her entire life outsmarting the most dangerous corporate criminals in America. He thought his white privilege would protect him from any real consequences. He thought he could steal my home and criminalize my daughter without facing the wrath of a mother fighting back. I packed up my encrypted laptop and placed it safely inside my designer handbag. I thanked Marcus for his incredibly swift and ruthless legal assistance. We shook hands knowing we were about to execute the most satisfying corporate takedown of our careers. I walked out of the glass skyscraper and stepped back into my waiting town car. The city of Atlanta buzzed with energy around me. I leaned back into the soft leather seats, feeling completely calm and prepared. Bradley wanted to play a very dangerous game of deception. Now he was about to lose everything he ever had today. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind of quiet that always precedes a massive hurricane. I sat at the dining table in my luxurious hotel suite looking out over the city. The legal trap was completely set. Marcus had prepared all the federal documents, and the local authorities were standing by for our signal. The massive financial fraud case was airtight and completely inescapable. But a small part of me, the part that had spent over 30 years navigating the complex federal court system, knew that judges always look favorably upon victims who show reasonable restraint. I did not want to show him any mercy at all, but I wanted my legal case to be so absolutely pristine that no defense attorney could ever claim I acted out of sudden malice or petty revenge. I needed to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Bradley was given every possible opportunity to walk away quietly, and he actively chose to stay and commit his crimes. So I decided to give him one final chance. It was not a chance to save his fake company or his frozen bank accounts. It was a chance to pack his bags and leave my property before the federal agents placed him in handcuffs in front of his wealthy investors. I opened my encrypted laptop and drafted a formal letter of demand. I kept the language incredibly simple and exceptionally polite. There were no threats and no mention of the massive federal fraud investigation currently looming over his arrogant head. I simply stated that as the sole legal owner of the Buckhead estate, I was officially revoking his permission to reside on the premises. I requested that he and Naya pack their personal belongings, vacate the property within 48 hours, and return the smart keys to my attorney. I printed the letter on heavy watermarked paper and signed my name at the bottom. I placed it inside a crisp white envelope and called a private courier service. I instructed the courier to deliver the letter directly into Bradley's hands at the house. I wanted him to hold his final warning in his own two hands. I knew exactly how he would react. A man completely consumed by his own arrogance will always view a polite warning as a sign of absolute weakness. The courier delivered the envelope at exactly noon. I received the digital confirmation on my phone. I sat back in my plush leather chair and waited. I knew Bradley was currently drowning in massive anxiety because his bank accounts were entirely frozen. He was desperately trying to keep his fake launch party on track for Friday evening. When he received my polite letter, he did not see a graceful exit strategy. He saw an elderly black woman sending a piece of paper because she supposedly had no real power to force him out physically. He thought my polite request was absolute proof that my bank stunt was just a temporary glitch he could eventually fix with his lawyers. He thought he was untouchable inside my house. His massive, fragile ego demanded that he mock me. He needed to prove to himself and to Nia that he was still the powerful head of the household, despite his rapidly crumbling reality. Bradley has always been obsessed with social media. He carefully curated his online presence to project the false image of a highly successful, wealthy tech entrepreneur. He constantly posted pictures of my expensive cars, my beautiful house, and my expensive wine collection, pretending they all belonged to his own hard work. He used the internet to build his fake reality entirely. So naturally, he turned to the internet to try and humiliate me one final time. I had created a silent, anonymous account months ago just to monitor his public posts. It is a standard procedure for any good forensic accountant. You always watch the digital footprint of your target, because arrogant criminals always love to brag about their supposed victories. About an hour after the private courier dropped off the letter, my phone buzzed with a notification. Bradley had just posted a new picture to his public story. I opened the application and looked at the bright screen. My blood ran completely cold, but my mind became incredibly sharp. He had placed my formal demand letter on the custom marble island in my kitchen. He took a high-resolution picture of the letter, clearly showing my signature at the bottom. Across the image, he pasted a massive laughing emoji. Below the emoji, he typed a caption that sealed his ultimate legal fate forever. The caption read, "Boomers and their cute little threats #myhouse." He actually typed those exact words for his thousands of fake followers to see. He was publicly claiming ownership of my $2.5 million property while openly mocking the true legal owner. He was laughing at my polite legal request for him to leave. He genuinely believed that posting a disrespectful picture online would make him look strong and dominant to his peers. He had absolutely no idea how the federal legal system actually works. In the complex world of civil and criminal litigation, intent is absolutely everything. Proving that someone committed a crime is only the first step. Proving that they committed the crime with deliberate malicious intent is what elevates the punishment to the absolute maximum level possible. When a federal judge reviews a case, they look for genuine remorse. They look to see if the defendant made a simple mistake or if they acted with cruel, unyielding arrogance. By posting that picture, Bradley had just handed me the final perfect piece of the puzzle. He completely destroyed any future defense his expensive lawyers might try to build. They could never claim he misunderstood the ownership of the house. They could never argue that he thought he had a legal right to stay. His public mockery proved that he fully understood my demand and actively chose to defy it with complete malicious arrogance. This was exactly what I needed to pursue severe punitive damages in civil court after the federal criminal trial was entirely over. Punitive damages are not just about recovering stolen money. They are specifically designed by the court system to punish a defendant for exceptionally reckless and malicious behavior. They are designed to completely ruin a person financially, so they never attempt to commit the same crime ever again. Bradley was already facing federal prison for the wire fraud and the forged signature on the commercial loan. But federal prison would only take his physical freedom. I wanted to take every single penny he might ever earn for the rest of his miserable, pathetic life. I wanted to ensure that when he eventually got out of prison, his future wages would be garnished indefinitely to pay off the massive civil judgments against him. I calmly pressed the buttons on my phone and took a clear, high-resolution screenshot of his digital post. I then used my secure laptop software to capture the back-end data of the post, proving the exact time and location it was uploaded from my personal kitchen network. I packaged the digital evidence and immediately emailed it to Marcus. Less than 2 minutes later, Marcus called my phone. He sounded almost giddy with professional legal excitement. I answered the call and listened to my ruthless attorney laugh out loud in his office. "Maxine, this boy is entirely brain dead," Marcus said through the phone. "I have seen incredibly stupid criminals in my 30-year career, but this takes the absolute prize today. We just secured the punitive damages easily. I am attaching this screenshot directly to the emergency injunction and the federal fraud file right now. When the judge sees this level of blatant disrespect coupled with the forged banking documents, they will not show him a single ounce of leniency." "I completely agree, Marcus," I replied smoothly. He thought he was playing a fun little internet game. He does not realize he just gave us the exact rope we need to hang him permanently. Is everything fully prepared for tomorrow night? Marcus confirmed that the local police, the private process servers, and the federal agents were all completely briefed and ready to move. The Sterling Capital managing partner was also flying down from New York specifically to attend the launch party in person. The trap was absolutely flawless. Bradley had his chance to walk away quietly today. I gave him a dignified exit strategy, and he spat right in my face. He chose to escalate the war. Now he was going to experience the devastating consequences of fighting a woman who controls the entire battlefield completely. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop for the evening. I ordered a light dinner from the hotel kitchen and ate it slowly while watching the sunset over the beautiful Atlanta skyline. I thought about Nia for a brief moment. I wondered if she saw the polite letter. I wondered if she laughed along with him when he posted that disrespectful picture. Her complete silence was her ultimate answer. She had completely surrendered her mind to his toxic illusions. She would have to face the terrifying reality right alongside him tomorrow night. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the grand launch party for his fake company NovaStream. Bradley was expecting wealthy investors, delicious catering, and massive applause for his fake genius. He was expecting to stand in my beautiful living room and secure $2 million to save his fraudulent empire. He was expecting to be the absolute king of the world. I finished my dinner and smiled into the quiet room. He had ignored the ultimatum. He had laughed at the warning. The time for polite letters was officially over forever. Tomorrow the law would finally speak for me. And it was going to be the loudest, most destructive sound he had ever heard in his entire life. Friday evening finally arrived, wrapping the city of Atlanta in a warm twilight breeze. My beautiful $2.5 million estate in Buckhead was completely transformed into a vibrant playground for the arrogant and the wealthy. Bradley had spared absolutely no expense for his massive corporate launch party. He had hired the most exclusive catering company in the entire city. Dozens of workers in crisp white uniforms scurried across my manicured lawns carrying heavy silver trays of expensive appetizers and crystal champagne flutes. They set up massive outdoor tents and dazzling light displays that illuminated the dark night sky. The sheer audacity of his lavish spending was incredibly staggering. He was using a frozen line of credit and stolen funds to throw a massive celebration in a house he did not legally own. I watched the entire spectacle unfold through the hidden security cameras I had secretly installed around the perimeter of the property years ago. I sat comfortably in my hotel suite, sipping a cup of hot chamomile tea while watching the live video feed on my encrypted laptop. The calm before the massive legal storm was incredibly beautiful to witness from a safe distance away here tonight. Nia was playing the role of the perfect supportive tech wife flawlessly. She wore a stunning crimson silk dress that hugged her figure completely. She glided through the growing crowd of guests with a bright, polished smile plastered across her face. She greeted local politicians, wealthy socialites, and hungry tech journalists with practiced elegance. She offered them premium cocktails and laughed at their polite jokes. Looking at her through the hidden camera feed, you would never ever guess that her credit cards had been completely declined at the luxury mall just a few days ago in total public humiliation today. She had completely buried her head in the sand. She chose to ignore the massive financial warning signs and blindly trusted the empty promises of her criminal husband. She wanted this fake lifestyle so desperately that she was willing to pretend everything was perfectly fine. She directed the catering staff with the unearned authority of a woman who genuinely believed she owned the mansion. She pointed toward the custom marble kitchen island, directing the bartenders to open more expensive bottles of vintage wine that my late husband had carefully collected over decades. She was giving away my legacy completely tonight. By 8 o'clock, the sweeping circular driveway was completely packed with high-end luxury vehicles. Valet drivers ran back and forth, parking expensive sports cars and heavy luxury trucks along the quiet residential street. The backyard was absolutely filled with the elite members of Atlanta society. Prominent tech journalists walked around with digital recorders, taking notes on the lavish display of supposed startup success. They were eager to write glowing profile articles about the brilliant young entrepreneur who was taking the financial world by storm. They had absolutely no idea they were attending a massive crime scene right here tonight. Bradley finally emerged from the house and stepped onto the outdoor patio. He looked like a man who had already conquered the entire universe. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that fit his tall frame perfectly. His hair was meticulously styled, and his teeth practically gleamed in the soft patio lighting. He held a glass of expensive bourbon in his right hand. He walked through the crowd exuding a toxic aura of supreme white privilege and unearned confidence. He patted older investors on the back and shook hands with the younger developers he had foolishly hired previously today. He was playing the part of the visionary genius to absolute perfection. He smiled warmly and spoke in empty corporate buzzwords about disruptive technology and future market share. He acted as if the massive fraud investigation currently looming over his head did not even exist. Perhaps he truly believed that because he had ignored my polite eviction letter, the problem had simply vanished into thin air. He thought his arrogant social media post had successfully intimidated me into complete silence. He thought he had successfully stolen my entire life without facing a single legal consequence from the federal authorities whatsoever. The ultimate peak of his false reality arrived precisely at 8:30. The managing partner of Sterling Capital stepped onto the patio. His name was Arthur, and he was a very distinguished older gentleman from New York. He was wearing a sharp dark suit and a very serious expression. Bradley immediately abandoned the group of local journalists and rushed over to greet the wealthy investor. Bradley extended his hand eagerly, completely unaware that Arthur already knew every single detail about the forged banking documents and the completely fake company. Arthur shook his hand with a tight, polite business smile instead. Arthur was a brilliant actor. He complimented Bradley on the beautiful house and the impressive turnout. Bradley puffed out his chest with immense pride. He told Arthur that he bought the Buckhead estate with his own early investments. He lied directly to the face of a man who held the irrefutable forensic proof of his massive federal crimes inside his briefcase. I watched this incredible interaction through the camera feed and felt a deep, satisfying chill run down my spine. The trap was holding perfectly. Bradley was actively digging his grave deeper with every single arrogant word he spoke loudly. At exactly 9 o'clock, Bradley signaled to the catering staff to turn down the ambient background music. He walked over to the grand stone staircase leading up to the main house and stood on the second step. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the loud chatter of the wealthy crowd. The guests slowly turned their attention toward him. Naya rushed over to stand proudly by the bottom of the stairs, gazing up at her husband with absolute blind adoration. The entire backyard fell completely silent, waiting for his arrogant speech tonight. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Bradley began, his voice projecting loudly across the manicured lawn. He smiled his signature arrogant smile. "Tonight is an incredibly special night for me and for my beautiful wife, Nia. We are officially launching NovaStream into the world. When I first came up with the idea for this company, people told me I was completely crazy. They told me the tech market was too saturated and the risks were simply too high, but I refused to listen to the doubters. I knew I had a brilliant vision for the incredible tech future." He paused dramatically to let his words sink in. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and eager journalists. "I built this entire company completely from the ground up." He lied smoothly without a single trace of guilt. "It took massive amounts of blood, sweat, and tears. It required countless sleepless nights and incredible personal sacrifice. I took massive financial risks because I deeply believed in the power of my proprietary software. And looking around this beautiful estate tonight, I can finally say that all those sacrifices were worth it." The sheer absolute audacity of his words was physically sickening. He had never sacrificed anything in his entire miserable life. He had stolen my money, forged her legal signature, and locked an elderly black woman out of her own home just to fund this pathetic illusion. He gestured expansively with his arms encompassing the massive mansion and the luxurious backyard. "This house represents my journey," he continued, his voice rising with fake emotion. "It represents the solid foundation I have built for my family and my incredibly loyal investors. We are standing on the ground of my success right now." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Tech journalists snapped rapid photographs of the brilliant young founder standing triumphantly on the steps of his supposed mansion. Nia clapped loudly with joyful tears welling up in her eyes. Arthur from Sterling Capital stood near the back of the crowd, simply clapping his hands slowly with a completely unreadable expression on his face. Bradley raised his glass high into the air to offer a final arrogant toast. To the future of NovaStream, he declared loudly, "To building empires from nothing and taking what is rightfully ours in this great, beautiful world today." Before the crowd could raise their glasses to join his toast, a deep, heavy rumble echoed from the front of the property. The sound of massive, high-performance engines completely drowned out the polite applause. Through the hidden security cameras, I watched as the heavy iron gates of my driveway were forcefully pushed open. A coordinated fleet of 6 massive black luxury sport utility vehicles rolled aggressively onto the property. They moved with terrifying military precision. They completely blocked the main exit, trapping the valet drivers, the expensive catering trucks, and every single wealthy guest tightly inside the estate tonight. The heavy iron gates of my Buckhead estate groaned loudly as they were forcefully pushed open by the lead black luxury vehicle. The massive tires crushed the loose gravel of the sweeping circular driveway, completely destroying the peaceful atmosphere of the lavish corporate party. 5 more identical vehicles followed closely behind, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. The valet drivers immediately dropped their keys and backed away in absolute shock. The expensive catering staff stopped serving the vintage wine and stared openly at the imposing motorcade. The bright headlights cut through the warm night air, illuminating the faces of the crowd. The entire backyard fell into a deep, suffocating silence. The music was abruptly cut off, leaving only the heavy rumbling sound of the powerful engines idling aggressively on my front lawn. I sat in the back of the lead vehicle, taking a slow, deep breath. My driver shifted the vehicle into park and quickly stepped out to open my passenger door. I stepped out onto the driveway, wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored crimson suit that commanded absolute authority. I looked like a federal judge arriving to deliver a completely inescapable death sentence to a very guilty man here tonight. I did not come alone. My brilliant attorney Marcus stepped out of the vehicle directly behind me, wearing his signature dark suit and holding a thick leather briefcase. That briefcase contained the complete financial destruction of my arrogant son-in-law. 2 highly trained private process servers stepped out of the third vehicle, clutching thick stacks of official federal legal documents. And finally, 4 fully uniformed Atlanta police officers emerged from the remaining vehicles. Their heavy-duty boots stomped loudly against the pavement. The flashing blue lights from their tactical gear reflected wildly across the pristine white party tents today. The wealthy guests began to whisper frantically among themselves. They were completely confused by the sudden arrival of law enforcement at an exclusive corporate event. Tech journalists raised their digital cameras, trying to capture the dramatic scene unfolding before their eyes. I walked slowly up the winding stone path toward the grand patio. My expensive heels clicked rhythmically against the stone pavers, sending a terrifying echo through the silent crowd. Marcus and the armed police officers flanked me, forming an impenetrable wall of absolute legal power. We moved as one single, unstoppable force of pure, righteous financial vengeance here today. Bradley was still standing on the second step of the grand stone staircase, holding his glass of expensive bourbon. His arrogant, confident smile had completely melted away the exact moment he saw my face. His entire body became rigid with pure, unadulterated terror. He looked past me and saw the armed police officers marching firmly up his supposed driveway. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. Nia was standing right beside him, clutching the wooden railing. Her eyes were wide with sheer, absolute panic as she finally realized I was serious today. Bradley realized his entire fake world was about to collapse publicly. He quickly handed his bourbon glass to a random guest standing nearby and practically leaped down the stone stairs. He pushed aggressively through the crowd of wealthy investors, desperate to intercept me before I could reach the center of the patio. He thought he could still control the narrative. He thought he could somehow intimidate me into leaving. He closed the physical distance between us, moving with frantic, erratic energy. He stopped directly in my path, attempting to block me just like he did a few days ago today. He leaned in close to my face, his breathing heavy and erratic. His expensive designer cologne could not hide the sour smell of his massive fear. "Maxine, what are you doing here?" he hissed furiously, dropping his voice into a harsh, desperate whisper so the journalists would not hear him. "Are you completely crazy? I told you not to come back here. You are ruining the most important night of my entire life. Get out of here right now before I call the security guards and have you arrested for criminal trespassing on my private property immediately, you insane woman." I stopped walking and looked directly into his panicked blue eyes. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I stood my ground, completely surrounded by my legal team and the armed officers. I let his pathetic little threats hang in the cool night air for a brief moment. He was still trying to play the role of the dominant homeowner. He was still trying to pretend he had any actual power over me. I looked at his expensive suit and his perfectly styled hair. I saw nothing but a weak, pathetic little boy playing a game today. "You cannot have me arrested for trespassing in my own house, Bradley," I replied softly, my voice completely steady and cold as solid ice. "I sent you a very polite letter yesterday morning asking you to leave my property peacefully. I gave you a chance to walk away with your dignity intact, but you decided to post a mocking picture on the internet instead. You laughed at my warning. You chose to stay and throw a massive party with stolen money. So now I'm going to let my friends handle the actual physical eviction process for me here tonight." Bradley gritted his teeth in absolute fury. He reached his hand out instinctively, trying to grab my arm and physically pull me away from the crowd. He wanted to drag me into the shadows so he could continue his pathetic manipulation without an audience. But before his fingers could even brush against the fabric of my crimson suit, Marcus stepped forward and forcefully slapped Bradley's hand away. "Do not ever touch my client," Marcus warned, his voice booming loudly across the silent patio. Bradley stumbled backward in shock, holding his hand against his chest like a wounded animal here today. Nia suddenly broke through the crowd and ran over to stand beside her trembling husband. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, please," she begged loudly, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please stop doing this to us. You are embarrassing us in front of all these important people. Why are you acting like a crazy person?" I looked at my daughter, feeling a deep, profound sadness mixed with absolute resolve. "I am not embarrassing you, Nia," I stated clearly. "Your husband embarrassed you the moment he forged your signature to commit a federal banking crime today." The wealthy guests gasped collectively. The word crime echoed through the crowd like a massive shockwave. The tech journalists immediately started typing frantically on their mobile devices. Bradley spun around and glared at the crowd, trying to desperately salvage his destroyed reputation. "Do not listen to her," he shouted frantically, waving his arms in the air. "She is a sick elderly woman suffering from severe dementia. She does not know what she is saying. This is just a massive misunderstanding over a simple family dispute. Everything is perfectly fine. We own this house completely fair and square right here today." Arthur, the managing partner of Sterling Capital, stepped slowly out from the massive crowd. He stood near the front, observing the entire confrontation with incredibly sharp, focused eyes. He looked at Bradley and then looked directly at me. I gave Arthur a very small, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur crossed his arms firmly over his chest and remained completely silent. He was not going to save Bradley. He was waiting to watch the total destruction of a man who tried to steal from a senior board member. Bradley noticed Arthur staring, and his desperate panic escalated to an entirely new level. Bradley turned back to me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am the legal owner of this property," he screamed, his voice breaking under the massive pressure. "I have the trust documents to prove it. You have absolutely no right to be here tonight. I am calling the real police right now." He reached frantically into his pocket to retrieve his cell phone. But before he could even unlock the digital screen, the heavy sound of tactical boots stepping forcefully onto the stone patio commanded the immediate attention of every single person present today. The lead police officer, a tall, intimidating man with a completely stern expression, bypassed Bradley entirely. The officer walked directly up to me and stopped. He did not look at my daughter or the angry man screaming about property rights. He treated Bradley like he was completely invisible. The officer adjusted his heavy utility belt and looked respectfully at me. "Ma'am, is this the man refusing to vacate your property?" the police officer asked, his loud, authoritative voice ringing out clearly over the silent, terrified crowd. Bradley completely froze in place, realizing he had finally lost absolutely everything forever today. The police officer stood tall and imposing on the grand stone patio. He looked directly at Bradley, waiting for an answer to his completely devastating question. Bradley could not speak a single word. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out into the cool night air. The wealthy guests and the eager tech journalists watched the confrontation in stunned, absolute silence. The soft, warm glow of the expensive outdoor string lights cast incredibly long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of my beautiful estate. The private process server walked slowly past the armed police officer. He was a very broad-shouldered man wearing a simple gray suit and sensible shoes. He held a massive, thick stack of heavy legal documents in his large hands. The papers were bound tightly together with thick black metal clips. They represented the absolute permanent end of Bradley's entirely fake corporate empire. The process server stopped right in front of my arrogant son-in-law. Bradley took a tiny, fearful step backward, accidentally bumping into his terrified wife, Naya. The server extended his right arm, holding the thick stack of papers directly toward Bradley's chest. "Are you Bradley?" he asked, his voice completely flat and professional, without any hint of emotion whatsoever. Bradley nodded his head very slowly, as if he were trapped in a terrible nightmare he could not escape. His eyes were completely glued to the heavy legal documents. The server pressed the papers firmly against Bradley's expensive tailored suit. "You have been officially served," he stated loudly so the entire crowd could hear him clearly. The server took a large step back, returning to his secure position right next to my brilliant attorney Marcus. Bradley instinctively grabbed the heavy papers with both hands to stop them from falling to the hard stone floor. He looked down at the bold black letters printed clearly on the front page of the massive packet. It was an emergency federal injunction and a legal notice of immediate physical eviction from the premises. The document clearly stated the immediate eviction was entirely based on severe financial elder abuse and active federal wire fraud charges. The words seemed to physically burn his trembling hands. He looked up at the large crowd of important people he had spent so many months trying to impress with his fake success. The tech journalists were typing incredibly fast on their mobile phones and tablets. They knew they were actively witnessing the ultimate public destruction of a rising corporate tech star tonight. The wealthy investors were whispering frantically to each other in the background. They were already calculating exactly how quickly they could legally distance themselves from this massive, unmitigated legal disaster. Bradley quickly realized his entire carefully crafted public reputation was rapidly disintegrating right in front of his own eyes. He desperately needed to spin the false narrative immediately before the damage became completely irreversible. He needed to convince these incredibly wealthy and powerful people that he was actually the innocent victim of a crazy, malicious old woman. He forced a very loud, incredibly unnatural laugh. The awful sound echoed awkwardly across the completely silent stone patio. He shook his head back and forth and looked at the large crowd with a completely fake, bright smile. "Well, this is certainly very embarrassing," he said, his voice pitching slightly higher than normal due to his immense internal panic. "Please do not worry about this, folks. This is just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. As I mentioned to some of you earlier, my poor elderly mother-in-law is unfortunately suffering from very severe, rapid-onset dementia. She gets incredibly confused about legal documents and basic property lines. Her mind is simply deteriorating very quickly. It is a very sad, tragic family situation that we are trying to handle privately." He walked down one single step to get slightly closer to his important guests. He held the heavy legal documents casually down at his side, as if they were just entirely meaningless pieces of scrap paper. "We have been actively trying to get her placed into a proper, secure medical facility for several weeks," now he lied incredibly smoothly without breaking eye contact with the crowd. "She is just acting out tonight because she is very scared and deeply confused about her surroundings. Please just ignore this little dramatic disruption." The local police officers are simply doing their job by politely following up on her incredibly delusional, paranoid complaints. "We will have this entire silly situation completely cleared up in about 5 minutes." Nia stepped forward immediately to completely support his massive, disgusting lie. She wiped the fake tears from her beautiful face and forced a very brave, supportive smile for the crowd to see. "Yes, it is completely true," Nia announced loudly to the crowd. "My mother is very sick right now. She really does not understand what she is doing here tonight. We just want her to get the immediate medical help she desperately needs right now. We love her so much, but she is completely out of control today." I stood perfectly still, watching my own only daughter willingly participate in my massive public character assassination. She was actively helping a literal criminal paint her own mother as a crazy, helpless old woman. She honestly thought she could easily manipulate the intelligent crowd with her fake tears and her incredibly expensive designer dress. But she completely underestimated the raw intelligence of the wealthy people standing in my beautiful backyard. The tech journalists and the wealthy elite investors were absolutely not fools. They saw the heavy armed police presence standing firmly on the patio. They saw the serious private process servers holding more documents. They saw the sheer unadulterated terror hiding right behind Bradley's incredibly fake, confident smile. More importantly, they clearly heard the specific legal words the process server used loudly. Immediate eviction and federal wire fraud are absolutely not terms ever associated with a simple dementia patient dispute. They are very serious terms permanently associated with massive federal corporate financial crimes. I absolutely did not yell at Bradley or call him a pathetic liar. I did not try to desperately defend my mental health to a large crowd of strangers who did not truly matter to my life. I knew perfectly well that arguing with him would only serve to validate his completely fake narrative. Instead, I simply looked over at my brilliant, ruthless attorney, Marcus. Marcus smiled a very cold, calculating smile and slowly pulled a single piece of crisp paper from his heavy leather briefcase. It was the official stamped digital receipt from the County Adult Protective Services Agency. Marcus cleared his throat loudly and spoke very clearly over the quiet, murmuring whispers of the wealthy crowd. "That is a very interesting medical diagnosis," Bradley Marcus announced incredibly confidently so everyone could hear. "Because the state-licensed social worker you falsely summoned to her hotel room yesterday afternoon completely cleared her of any cognitive decline whatsoever. In fact, that specific social worker is now our primary sworn witness in the massive federal fraud case currently pending against you today." Bradley's completely fake, confident smile vanished entirely from his pale face. His desperate, pathetic lies were being systematically dismantled in real time, directly in front of his most important guests. He looked out at the tech journalists and quickly realized they were digitally recording every single damning word Marcus was saying. The smart journalists were actively capturing the exact precise moment his completely fake tech startup died, a very public death. He took another shaky step backward, completely overwhelmed by the sheer massive magnitude of the terrifying legal situation. He desperately tried to think of another clever lie to save himself, but his panicked brain was completely frozen solid. He looked down at the heavy, thick stack of official eviction papers, still clutched tightly in his shaking hand. He finally realized he was not just losing his completely fake software company today. He was losing his physical, luxurious home and his entire stolen, wealthy lifestyle forever tonight. The armed police officers stood very firmly at the bottom of the grand stone stairs, quietly waiting for the exact perfect moment they needed to physically intervene. The wealthy guests slowly started taking steps backward, physically moving away from Bradley as if his financial crimes were a highly contagious, deadly disease. Absolutely nobody wanted to be publicly associated with a desperate man actively facing many years in federal prison. The entire atmosphere of the evening shifted rapidly from a lavish, exciting corporate celebration to a highly terrifying, active criminal investigation. I looked completely past Bradley and carefully scanned the large crowd of wealthy, frightened guests. I was searching very specifically for one single important person. I was looking for the incredibly powerful man who currently held the absolute ability to completely destroy Bradley's final remaining shred of hope forever. I finally found him standing very quietly near the back of the crowd, right next to the large, blooming hydrangea bushes. Arthur, the lead senior managing partner from Sterling Capital, was silently watching the entire dramatic scene unfold with a completely blank, expressionless face. He was an incredibly wealthy man who commanded absolute total respect in the global financial world. He had flown all the way down from his massive office in New York City just to specifically attend this entirely fake corporate launch party. He had come here specifically to personally witness the absolute total destruction of the arrogant young man who foolishly tried to steal from his highly prestigious investment firm. I made very direct, intense eye contact with Arthur across the distance of the patio. The entire backyard was completely silent, except for the gentle rustling of the warm wind blowing through the large old oak trees. I gave Arthur one single, very subtle, slow nod of my head. It was a completely silent mutual signal passing directly between two highly experienced apex predators who understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of total corporate warfare perfectly. Arthur clearly received the silent signal and very slowly uncrossed his arms from his chest. He stepped out away from the dark shadows of the beautiful hydrangea bushes and walked very purposefully toward the front of the terrified crowd. The other wealthy guests immediately parted ways to let him walk through. They instantly recognized his incredible massive wealth and his totally undeniable corporate authority. Arthur walked right up to the very bottom of the grand stone staircase and stood directly in front of the armed police officers. He looked slowly up at Bradley with incredibly sharp eyes that were as cold and entirely unforgiving as a brutal winter snowstorm. Bradley swallowed very hard, causing a large bead of nervous sweat to drip slowly down his extremely pale forehead. He still foolishly hoped Arthur would somehow miraculously save his company. He still desperately hoped his completely fake tech presentation had been convincing enough to secure the massive $2 million investment check. Arthur slowly adjusted his incredibly expensive silk tie and prepared to speak very publicly to the completely terrified, arrogant man standing helplessly above him today. Arthur stood at the bottom of the grand stone staircase looking up at Bradley with absolute disgust. The warm night breeze suddenly felt incredibly cold as everyone waited for the powerful man to speak. Arthur did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who controlled billions of dollars. "Bradley," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any professional courtesy. "As of exactly 5 minutes ago, the executive board of Sterling Capital was fully informed of your fraudulent collateral claims. We are pulling our $5 million funding entirely. You are finished." The heavy words hit Bradley like a massive physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, gripping the stone railing of the staircase to keep himself from collapsing completely. The wealthy investors standing in the crowd gasped out loud. The tech journalists immediately began typing frantically into their mobile phones, capturing every single devastating detail of the massive corporate downfall. "No," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with sheer absolute panic. "No, Arthur, you cannot do this to me. This is all a massive lie. She is lying to you today. I own this house completely. I have the legal deed." He frantically dug his hand into his expensive tailored suit pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he almost dropped the digital device onto the hard stone patio. He desperately swiped at the glowing screen, trying to open the file folder containing his forged property trust documents. "Look at this, Arthur," he pleaded, holding the small screen out toward the wealthy investor. "Look at the signature. It is completely legal and fully notarized. My insane mother-in-law is just trying to sabotage my massive success because she is deeply jealous of me." Arthur did not even bother to look at the glowing screen. He simply shook his head slowly and took a large step back, effectively distancing himself from the pathetic, desperate criminal standing on the stairs. That is when I decided it was time to finally end his fake narrative once and for all. I stepped forward, bypassing my attorney Marcus, and walked right up to the bottom of the stone staircase. I looked up at the arrogant boy who had kicked me out into the freezing rain just 3 days ago. I did not yell. I projected my voice clearly. I systematically used the precise forensic accounting terminology that I had used to destroy corrupt billionaires for over 35 years. "Put your phone away, Bradley," I commanded my voice, slicing through his pathetic whimpering. "That digital document is a complete fabrication. Let us explain exactly how you built this supposed empire to your incredibly important guests tonight. You established your company as a limited liability shell in Delaware using a cheap registered agent service to intentionally hide your complete lack of operating capital. You then falsely inflated your projected revenue metrics by classifying personal family loans as client retainers. That is a textbook definition of corporate financial misrepresentation." Bradley stood completely frozen, staring down at me with wide, terrified eyes. His mouth hung open, but he could not formulate a single intelligent response to my incredibly precise accusations. I turned my body slightly so I could address the large crowd of journalists and investors directly, but the corporate misrepresentation was not enough for him. I continued, my voice ringing out clearly across the silent, manicured lawn. 3 months ago, this brilliant young entrepreneur realized his fake company was rapidly running out of money, so he approached a predatory lender. He sought to secure a $1.5 million commercial line of credit. Because his company possessed absolutely zero actual physical assets, he needed to provide massive personal collateral to secure the loan. He chose to use my $2.5 million Buckhead estate as that collateral without my knowledge or consent. The crowd murmured in absolute shock. Naya let out a small, terrified whimper from her spot on the stairs, but I completely ignored her, to bypass the strict banking regulations. Bradley fabricated an entirely fake entity called the Executive Trust, I explained systematically, walking the crowd. I walked the crowd through his exact criminal methodology. He completely forged my legal signature on the primary property transfer documents. But the banking institution required a secondary guarantor because the primary asset holder was supposedly placing the estate into a corporate trust. So this incredibly loving husband took the documents home and completely forged the legal signature of his own wife, Nia, on the guarantor liability line. He effectively made his own wife an unwitting accomplice to massive federal wire fraud and severe mortgage fraud just to keep his fake software company afloat for a few more unfortunate months. Nia gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as the absolute horrifying reality of my words finally crashed down upon her. She looked at Bradley with a completely shattered expression. "You forged my signature," she whispered, her voice trembling with pure, devastated heartbreak. "You put my name on a fraudulent loan document." Bradley completely ignored his crying wife. He was totally focused on the wealthy investors who were actively walking away from the patio. "Please listen to me," he begged desperately, reaching his hands out toward the retreating crowd. "She is making all of this up. You have to believe me tonight. I am a visionary. I am going to change the entire world with my proprietary software. You cannot just abandon me here. Your software is nothing more than a cheap white-labeled template you purchased online for $300, I stated loudly, completely crushing his final desperate lie. You have absolutely no proprietary code. You have no actual engineering team. You have been using the fraudulent commercial loan to lease expensive vehicles, buy tailored suits, and host lavish parties exactly like this one to project a completely false image of massive success. You engaged in deliberate systemic fiduciary breach. You intentionally pierced the corporate veil by commingling your stolen business funds with your frozen personal checking accounts. Every single dollar you spent tonight was stolen directly from the equity of my home. You are not a tech visionary, Bradley. You are simply a very sloppy, unoriginal thief who picked the absolute worst possible target in the entire world. The absolute silence that followed my forensic breakdown was incredibly heavy. The tech journalists had stopped typing and were simply staring at Bradley with complete professional disgust. Arthur adjusted his expensive suit jacket and gave me a very small, respectful nod. Arthur turned around and walked completely off the property. The other wealthy investors quickly followed his lead, practically running toward the front gate to escape the massive legal disaster. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man facing imminent federal prison time. Bradley's entire fake world was completely disintegrating right in front of his own eyes. The money was gone. His reputation was entirely destroyed. His wealthy friends were completely abandoning him. He looked out at the empty lawn and the remaining police officers with a look of pure, unadulterated madness, completely taking over his pale, terrified face tonight. He slowly turned his head and looked directly down at me. The sheer absolute panic in his eyes was rapidly replaced by a dark, violent rage. He had lost everything, and his fragile, arrogant ego simply could not handle the incredibly public humiliation. He blamed me entirely for his massive downfall. He blamed the intelligent black woman who refused to stay quiet and simply let him steal her entire legacy. "You ruined my entire life!" he screamed at the absolute top of his lungs. His voice sounded like a wild, cornered animal. "You ruined everything, you incredibly stupid old woman." Before anyone could even react, Bradley completely snapped. He let out a furious, terrifying roar and lunged directly down the stone stairs toward me. His hands were curled into tight, violent fists, and his face was twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure hatred. He intended to physically attack me right there in front of the armed police officers and the remaining guests. But I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground, completely calm and entirely prepared for his pathetic, violent outburst. He never even made it to the bottom step today. The heavy, tactical boots of the Atlanta police officers moved with incredible lightning speed. Before Bradley could even reach his arms out to grab me, two massive uniformed officers rushed forward and intercepted him midair. They grabbed him by his expensive tailored suit jacket and forcefully slammed him face first into the soft manicured lawn. The heavy impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs, causing him to let out a loud, pathetic groan of absolute pain. The officers immediately pinned his arms tightly behind his back, completely neutralizing his violent, desperate physical attack perfectly and permanently tonight. The heavy impact of Bradley's body hitting the ground sent a dull thud echoing across the beautiful stone patio. The two massive Atlanta police officers held him down firmly against the perfectly manicured grass. Bradley gasped loudly for air as the sharp blades of grass pressed aggressively into his expensive tailored cheek. He tried to wiggle his shoulders and resist the physical hold, but the officers were incredibly strong and entirely professional. One officer placed a heavy knee directly onto Bradley's lower back, completely neutralizing any further violent movement. Then came the absolute most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire 35-year career as a federal forensic accountant. It was the sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly shut around Bradley's wrists. The sound cut through the warm night air with absolute stunning clarity. Bradley let out a pathetic, whining noise that sounded exactly like a frightened child. The lead police officer grabbed Bradley by the back of his expensive suit jacket and forcefully hauled him up to his feet. Bradley's perfectly styled hair was now completely disheveled and covered in loose dirt and green grass stains. His custom charcoal gray suit was totally ruined. The officer turned him around to face the massive crowd of terrified wealthy investors and shocked tech journalists. Bradley was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down in sheer absolute panic. "Bradley, you are officially under arrest," the lead police officer stated, his voice booming loudly over the silent, terrified crowd. "You are being charged with multiple counts of felony forgery and massive federal wire fraud. You are also being charged with severe mortgage fraud regarding the illegal transfer of this physical property. And finally, based on the sworn legal testimony of the county social worker, you are being charged with criminal elder abuse for filing a completely false medical report against the legal homeowner today. The incredible poetic irony of that final charge was absolutely delicious. Bradley had desperately tried to use the State Adult Protective Services Agency as a weapon to completely destroy my life. He wanted to lock me away in a rural nursing home and steal my $2.5 million house. He thought his completely fake dementia claim would silence me forever. Instead, his incredibly malicious false report had triggered an automatic felony charge under the Elder Abuse Protection statutes. He literally dug his own criminal grave and jumped directly into it. Bradley frantically shook his head back and forth as the officer continued to read him his constitutional rights. "No," he screamed desperately, trying to pull his handcuffed wrists away from the strong grip of the police officer. "You cannot do this to me today. I am a wealthy tech founder. I am a completely innocent man. Nia, please help me right now. Tell them I am completely innocent. Tell them your mother is insane and making all of this up to ruin our beautiful family tonight." He looked wildly at his wife, completely expecting her to somehow miraculously save him from federal prison. Nia stood completely frozen on the second step of the grand stone staircase. Her beautiful face was streaked with heavy dark mascara tears. Her expensive crimson silk dress fluttered slightly in the warm evening breeze. She stared at the heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around her husband's wrists, and she simply could not move a single muscle. The massive, terrifying reality of his federal banking crimes had finally completely shattered her perfect little wealthy illusion forever. She knew I possessed the undeniable forensic proof of her forged signature. She knew he had willingly sacrificed her freedom to save his completely fake software company. "Nia, do something!" Bradley shrieked at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Call my parents immediately. Call our private lawyers right now. Do not just stand there like a stupid idiot and watch them take me away today." His true, incredibly toxic nature was finally fully exposed for every single person to see clearly. The moment he was backed into a corner, he immediately turned violently against the very woman he claimed to love. He verbally abused her right in front of the entire elite society of Atlanta. The wealthy guests did not step forward to help him. They did not call their own expensive lawyers to intervene. Instead, they all simultaneously reached for their mobile phones. The bright digital flashes of dozens of cell phone cameras illuminated the dark patio. The tech journalists and the wealthy socialites were actively recording every single pathetic second of his massive public downfall. They were capturing the exact moment the arrogant fake visionary was completely humiliated and dragged away in steel handcuffs. The whispered conversations grew incredibly loud as the crowd actively mocked his massive failure. Everyone immediately realized they needed to escape the property before the federal authorities began asking them uncomfortable questions about their own financial involvement with his completely fake company. A massive chaotic exodus began instantly. The incredibly wealthy investors turned their backs on the patio and practically sprinted toward the long circular driveway. They loudly demanded their luxury vehicles from the completely overwhelmed valet drivers. The beautiful, elegant corporate launch party had rapidly devolved into a terrified, panicked stampede of wealthy people desperately trying to flee an active crime scene tonight. The catering staff quickly realized the party was entirely over. They immediately stopped serving the expensive vintage wine and the gourmet appetizers. The workers silently began packing up their silver trays and folding the white tablecloths, completely ignoring the screaming, handcuffed man standing on the lawn. They moved with quiet, professional efficiency, wanting to leave the disastrous event as quickly as humanly possible. The beautiful outdoor string lights continued to glow warmly, casting long, haunting shadows over the completely chaotic scene unfolding in my beautiful backyard. The lead police officer tightened his incredibly firm grip on Bradley's arm and began walking him forcefully toward the massive iron gate at the front of the property. Bradley dragged his feet through the grass, completely refusing to walk like a dignified man. He continued to scream and cry incredibly loud, begging the wealthy investors to stay and listen to his fake business pitch. He screamed at the tech journalists, begging them not to publish the terrible truth about his forged banking documents. He was a completely broken, pathetic mess of a human being, entirely stripped of his unearned white privilege and his massive, toxic arrogance today. I stood incredibly still and watched them drag him completely away from my beautiful house. I felt a deep, profound sense of complete righteous vindication wash entirely over my soul. I had spent 35 years destroying corrupt corporate executives in cold, sterile federal courtrooms. But this specific victory was incredibly personal and deeply, deeply satisfying. I had successfully protected my massive financial legacy from a greedy, arrogant boy who thought he could easily manipulate an older black woman without facing any severe consequences. I let the law speak for me, and the law was currently tossing him directly into the back of a cold, dark police cruiser tonight. The heavy door of the police vehicle slammed loudly shut completely, cutting off his desperate, pathetic screaming. The incredibly bright, flashing blue and red emergency lights illuminated the entire street as the luxury sport utility vehicles slowly backed out of my long, sweeping driveway. The federal authorities and the local police officers completely removed the massive toxic infection from my beautiful estate forever. I watched the taillights disappear completely down the dark, quiet residential street, leaving only the massive, chaotic wreckage of his absolutely fake corporate launch party behind. The large crowd of wealthy guests had completely vanished. The catering trucks were rapidly pulling away from the curb. The incredibly loud party was over, leaving behind a deafening, heavy silence. The beautiful stone patio was now completely littered with discarded crystal champagne flutes and half-eaten expensive appetizers. The perfectly manicured lawn was completely trampled and ruined by the heavy tactical boots and the panicked running guests. It looked exactly like a massive destructive hurricane had simply ripped right through the center of my peaceful, completely secure life today. I slowly turned my attention away from the empty driveway and looked back at the grand stone staircase. My brilliant attorney Marcus stood quietly near the large blooming hydrangea bushes, casually packing his heavy legal documents back into his expensive leather briefcase. The private process servers had already quietly departed the scene, having successfully completed their important legal duties today. There was only one single person left standing in the massive ruined wreckage of the extravagant fake celebration tonight. Nia was completely alone. My 32-year-old daughter stood trembling on the hard stone steps, entirely surrounded by the physical garbage of her completely shattered false reality. Her expensive crimson silk dress looked incredibly foolish and entirely out of place in the empty, ruined backyard. The man she had blindly chosen over her own loving mother was currently sitting in the back of a police car, facing decades in federal prison. Her bank accounts were completely frozen solid by my legal team. Her credit cards were totally useless pieces of melted plastic. She had absolutely no money and entirely no future with her fake tech visionary husband today. She slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. Her dark eyes were completely filled with massive, overwhelming fear and incredible, absolute humiliation. She had actively helped him lock me out of my own house. She had loudly called me a monster and completely severed our entire family relationship just a few days ago. But now that her entire fake wealthy world had violently collapsed into absolute nothingness, she instinctively reverted back to the frightened little girl who desperately needed her strong, capable mother to fix her terrible mistakes. She took a slow, shaky step down the grand stone staircase. Her expensive designer heels clicked softly against the hard stone. She reached her trembling hand out toward me, looking for the warm, comforting embrace she had completely rejected earlier this week. She fully expected me to simply open my arms and completely forgive her massive, horrible betrayal. She expected me to pay off his massive debts and quietly save her from the terrifying legal consequences of her own terrible decisions tonight. She looked at me with incredibly desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging for the complete, unconditional maternal salvation I had always freely provided her entire life. The massive stone patio was completely empty, except for me, my daughter, and my attorney, Marcus. The flashing blue lights from the police cruisers at the end of the street slowly faded away, leaving us in the warm, dim light of the ruined corporate party. Nia took another slow, shaky step down the grand staircase. Her expensive crimson silk dress was stained with spilled wine, and her perfect makeup was completely ruined by her heavy tears. She looked exactly like a completely broken little girl. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own waist, shivering slightly despite the warm summer night air. She walked slowly across the trampled grass, moving toward me with her head held low in absolute shame. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently I could barely hear the word. I stood completely still and waited for her to speak. "Please look at me," she begged, taking one final step until she was standing directly in front of me. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea he was doing any of those terrible things. I swear to you, I did not know he forged my signature on those banking documents today." I looked deeply into her dark eyes, searching for any trace of genuine truth. She reached out and grabbed my hands. Her fingers were completely ice cold. I thought his company was actually successful. She cried loudly, tears streaming down her face. "He completely lied to me about the money. He told me the bank accounts were completely fine. He told me the luxury cars were paid for by his massive corporate profits. I never would have let him use this house as collateral if I knew the real truth. You have to believe me, Mom. I am your only daughter. You know I would never intentionally try to steal your house or put you in danger." She squeezed my hands desperately, trying to force me to comfort her. She was actively playing the role of the innocent blind victim who was completely manipulated by a terrible man. She wanted me to wrap my arms around her and tell her everything was going to be perfectly fine. She expected me to pay off his massive debts and let her stay safely inside my beautiful $2.5 million Buckhead estate tonight. I slowly pulled my hands away from her desperate grip. I did not yell at her. I did not raise my voice or show any outward anger. I simply looked at her with incredibly profound, heartbreaking clarity. "I do not care what he told you about his fake company, Nia," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "I do not care if he lied to you about his frozen bank accounts or his leased luxury cars. Those are simply financial details. What I care about is exactly how you treated me when he decided to throw me out into the freezing rain just 3 days ago." Nia flinched violently as if I had physically struck her across the face. She took a tiny step backward, wrapping her arms tightly around herself again. But I did not stop speaking. I needed her to understand the absolute finality of her own terrible choices. "You sat at my dining room table, Nia," I continued softly. "You sat right there in your beautiful designer dress while your husband physically blocked me from walking into my own kitchen." I watched the devastating memory flash across her tear-stained face. "You watched him shove my heavy winter coat right into my chest." I said, my words slicing through the quiet night air like a surgical scalpel. "You heard him tell me I was a massive embarrassment to his wealthy friends. You listened to him tell me to go find a cheap motel for the night. And what did you do, Nia? You did absolutely nothing to help me. You did not stand up to defend your own mother. You did not remind him that he was living completely rent-free in my house. You simply looked away. You picked up your crystal glass and you drank your expensive red wine while he completely stole my dignity today." Nia began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands. "I am sorry," she wailed loudly. "I was just so scared of ruining his big presentation. He was under so much pressure to perform. Please, Mom, you cannot leave me out here all alone. He is going to federal prison, and I have absolutely nothing left in this entire world. Please let me stay inside the house tonight," she begged, dropping down onto her knees on the hard stone patio. "I will do whatever you want. I will get a job and pay you rent. I will divorce him tomorrow morning. Just please do not turn me away into the dark street. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I looked down at my weeping daughter. The overwhelming maternal instinct to protect her was incredibly strong, but my absolute self-respect was significantly stronger. I had warned her about the massive danger when her credit cards were completely declined at the luxury boutique yesterday. I specifically told her he had forged her legal signature. I offered to protect her with my expensive lawyers, and she responded by calling me a toxic monster and telling me I was completely dead to her forever. She had confidently chosen her toxic, arrogant husband over her loving mother. Now she was completely terrified because her chosen path had led directly to total public destruction. "You made your ultimate choice, Nia," I stated firmly, looking down at her kneeling form today. "When I called you from my hotel suite and tried to warn you about the federal fraud, you screamed at me," I reminded her clearly. "You told me I was insane. You told me you never wanted to speak to me again. You actively chose to stand by his side and defend his criminal behavior. You chose to completely sever our family bond just to protect your fake wealthy illusion. And when you make adult choices, you have to suffer the massive adult consequences entirely alone. You watched him throw me out into the rain, Nia. You drank your wine while he stole my dignity. You chose your side, and now you have to live on that side forever." I turned my head and looked over at my attorney Marcus. He was quietly watching the heartbreaking scene unfold with complete professional detachment. Marcus walked over to a stack of expensive catering supplies that had been completely abandoned near the back door of the house. He reached down and grabbed 2 large black plastic garbage bags. He walked back across the patio and handed both empty bags directly to me tonight. I took the heavy plastic bags and looked back down at Nia. She was staring at the black bags with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She finally realized I was absolutely serious. I was not going to save her from the massive wreckage she had actively helped create. I unfolded the plastic bags and let them drop down onto the stone patio right in front of her expensive designer heels. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she understood the absolute, undeniable reality of her incredibly dark future. "You have exactly 15 minutes to pack your personal clothes," I commanded, my voice completely cold and totally unforgiving. "You may only take the items you can personally fit inside these 2 plastic bags tonight. You will leave your expensive jewelry and your designer handbags behind because they were purchased with my stolen equity. The armed police officers are currently waiting at the front gate to ensure you safely vacate the premises completely. When your 15 minutes are up, the officers will permanently lock all the doors, and you will never step foot inside this beautiful house ever again today." Nia stared down at the empty black plastic garbage bags lying on the cold ground. She slowly lifted her heavy head and looked at my face one final, devastating time. She finally realized the strong, fiercely protective mother she had known her entire life was completely gone forever. I had been permanently replaced by a ruthless woman who demanded absolute respect and total accountability. She slowly reached down with violently shaking hands and picked up the dark plastic bags. She stood up from the hard stone patio without saying another single word. She turned around and slowly walked up the grand wooden staircase, looking completely defeated and entirely broken inside. I stood silently in the cool night air and watched my only daughter completely disappear into the massive dark house. The ultimate cost of her cowardly silence was incredibly high. She was finally paying the massive, terrible price entirely alone tonight, without any safety net left to catch her when she inevitably hits the absolute bottom. 3 months passed since the devastating night of the completely fake corporate launch party. The hot, sticky heat of the Georgia summer slowly faded into a crisp, cool autumn. I sat in the second row of the heavy wooden benches inside the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The room was incredibly cold and entirely sterile. It was the exact opposite of the warm, lavish environments Bradley always preferred. I wore a sharp, tailored navy blue suit and sat completely still, observing the final legal proceedings. My attorney Marcus sat directly beside me, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. We were there to witness the absolute final chapter of my complete financial vengeance. The massive federal wire fraud and severe mortgage fraud case had moved through the justice system with incredible lightning speed. The federal prosecutors had absolutely no problem securing a massive guilty plea. The mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence I provided made it completely impossible for any defense attorney to fight the massive charges. Bradley was officially facing 5 to 7 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant boy who tried to steal my home was finally going to face the reality of federal prison. I felt no sympathy for his pathetic situation today. I looked closely at the man sitting at the heavy wooden defense table. Bradley looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant tech visionary who had confidently kicked me out of my own home into the freezing rain. His perfect designer suits were completely gone forever. He was wearing an incredibly oversized bright orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. His perfectly styled blonde hair was completely unkempt and losing its vibrant color. He looked incredibly pale and terribly exhausted. He had lost a significant amount of weight during his 3 months in the county holding facility. The incredibly confident, arrogant smirk that used to constantly rest on his face was entirely erased. He kept his heavy head bowed low, staring blankly at the dark wooden table. He finally understood the massive, terrifying reality of his own terrible choices. He was completely bankrupt and totally destroyed. The federal government had systematically seized every single asset he falsely claimed to own. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. The massive luxury cars were completely gone. The expensive designer watches were completely confiscated to help pay back the massive stolen funds. He was entirely stripped of his completely fake wealth and his unearned white privilege. The most incredibly poetic justice of the entire courtroom scene was the complete empty space on the wooden benches directly behind him. Bradley's extremely wealthy, snobby parents, Richard and Eleanor, were absolutely nowhere to be found today. They did not show up to support their only son during his massive federal sentencing hearing. The moment the incredibly embarrassing public scandal hit the local news, they immediately cut all ties with him completely. They were terrified that the federal investigators would start looking closely into their own highly questionable financial situations. They wanted absolutely no part of his massive public disgrace. They refused to hire an expensive private defense lawyer to help him fight the federal charges. They simply abandoned him to the overworked public defender system. He was completely isolated from the wealthy, white, privileged world he had desperately tried to impress. He was finally facing the incredibly harsh reality of the criminal justice system completely alone, without his family safety net to catch him. He turned his head slightly and looked back at the completely empty wooden benches behind him. A single tear rolled slowly down his pale, dirty cheek when he fully realized his own parents had completely abandoned him to his dark, terrible fate today. My daughter Nia was also completely absent from the cold federal courtroom today. Her entire life had violently collapsed into absolute ruin the exact moment the armed police officers locked the heavy doors of my Buckhead estate 3 months ago. Because she had foolishly believed his massive lies and allowed her name to remain on the completely fraudulent joint banking accounts, she inherited his massive, crushing financial debts. She was completely legally responsible for the massive overdraft fees and the incredibly high interest penalties he secretly accumulated. Nia was currently living in a very cramped, dirty studio apartment in a highly dangerous neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. The beautiful, wealthy tech wife was now working 2 incredibly exhausting minimum wage jobs just to survive. She worked as a barista early in the morning and waitressed at a cheap, dirty diner late into the night. She was desperately trying to pay off the massive mountain of toxic debt her criminal husband had maliciously left in her name. She had absolutely no expensive designer clothes left to wear. She had absolutely no fancy corporate parties left to attend. She was simply trying to keep the electricity turned on inside her tiny, miserable apartment every single month. While I sat quietly in the federal courtroom, my personal cell phone vibrated silently inside my designer handbag. I waited until the federal judge called for a brief morning recess before I stepped out into the bright marble hallway to check the digital notification. I had received a new, incredibly long voicemail from Nia. I pressed the small play button and held the phone close to my ear. Her voice sounded incredibly weak and terribly exhausted. "Mom, please pick up the phone," she begged. Her voice cracking with heavy, desperate tears. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said to you. You were completely right about him. He completely ruined my entire life and left me with absolutely nothing. I cannot afford to buy groceries this week. I am completely drowning in this massive, terrible debt. Please, Mom, I am begging you to forgive me. Please help me pay these terrible bills. I miss you so much, and I just want to come back home to you today. I am so incredibly tired of living exactly like this. Please just give me one more chance to prove I love you." I stood completely still in the cold marble hallway and listened to her desperate, pathetic sobbing until the incredibly long voicemail finally ended. I felt a very small, brief pang of maternal sadness deep within my chest, but I quickly pushed it completely away. She was only apologizing because the massive, crushing consequences of her own terrible actions had finally become entirely unbearable. She did not actually miss me. She simply missed my massive financial protection and my luxurious, beautiful home. She missed the incredibly comfortable life I had freely provided for her over the past 32 years. I looked down at the bright digital screen of my cell phone. I did not text her back. I did not call her to offer my warm, loving forgiveness. I simply pressed the small red delete button, completely erasing her desperate message forever. I placed the phone safely back inside my expensive designer handbag and walked calmly back inside the massive federal courtroom. The federal judge, a very stern older woman with incredibly sharp eyes, took her seat high up on the heavy wooden bench. The entire courtroom stood up respectfully and then quickly sat back down in total, absolute silence today. The federal judge looked directly down at Bradley with a completely unforgiving expression on her face. She read the incredibly long list of his massive corporate crimes out loud for the official court record. She explicitly mentioned his cruel, incredibly malicious attempt to use the County Adult Protective Services Agency to falsely imprison his own elderly mother-in-law. She stated firmly that his massive financial crimes were absolutely entirely driven by pure, unadulterated toxic greed and massive personal arrogance. She raised her heavy wooden gavel high into the air. She officially sentenced Bradley to 7 incredibly long years in a maximum security federal prison. She also ordered him to pay massive permanent financial restitution for the remainder of his entire pathetic life. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down loudly, echoing through the completely silent courtroom like a massive thunderclap. 2 armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward and grabbed Bradley roughly by the arms. They physically dragged him completely away from the wooden defense table. He did not fight back or scream this time. He simply let his head hang completely down in total, absolute defeat as they walked him through the heavy wooden doors and entirely out of my beautiful, successful life forever. After the hearing concluded, Marcus and I drove directly back to my Buckhead estate. We sat down at my mahogany desk. Marcus placed a stack of important legal documents directly in front of me. I picked up my heavy gold pen. I smoothly signed my name on the final legal paperwork, transferring my entire $8 million estate into an untouchable charitable trust specifically designed to fund the college education of brilliant young black women entering the financial sector. The first thing I did after the federal sentencing was hire a massive demolition and interior design crew to completely gut the entire east wing of my beautiful Buckhead estate. I absolutely refused to live inside a house that held any lingering physical memories of my incredible betrayal. The massive custom bed where Bradley and Nia used to sleep was completely dragged out to the driveway and loaded into a heavy dump truck to be destroyed forever. I hired incredibly expensive contractors to rip out the hardwood floors they had walked on and replace them with imported dark mahogany wood. I brought in completely new luxury furniture imported directly from Italy. Every single wall in the massive house was painted a bright, crisp white to completely scrub away the dark, toxic energy they had maliciously brought into my incredibly peaceful sanctuary. The entire massive remodeling process took exactly 2 months and cost a significant amount of money, but it was worth absolutely every single penny to completely reclaim my personal physical space today. My beautiful home was finally entirely mine again. There were absolutely no more arrogant tech founders walking through my hallways pretending to own my incredible wealth. There were absolutely no more ungrateful daughters sitting at my dining table drinking my expensive wine while ignoring my basic human dignity. The air inside the massive house felt incredibly light and completely pure for the very first time in over a year. I walked through the beautifully redesigned rooms and felt a deep, profound sense of complete, absolute peace wash entirely over my soul. I had successfully defended my massive financial empire from incredibly greedy thieves. I had permanently removed the toxic infection from my family tree. I was finally ready to open my beautiful heavy oak doors once again, but this time I would only allow genuine love and absolute mutual respect to step foot inside my completely restored castle tonight. I decided to host my own incredibly lavish Sunday dinner to officially celebrate my complete, absolute victory. I did not hire an expensive corporate catering company to serve tiny, pretentious appetizers to a crowd of completely fake strangers. Instead, I spent the entire beautiful Sunday morning standing inside my custom marble kitchen, personally cooking a massive traditional soul food feast. I prepared incredibly rich macaroni and cheese, massive pots of slow-cooked collard greens, and perfectly seasoned fried chicken. The beautiful warm smells of my childhood completely filled the massive house, replacing the cold, sterile corporate atmosphere Bradley had previously tried to create. I set the massive 12-seater dining table with my absolute best crystal glasses and my most expensive imported china plates. I polished the heavy silver flatware until it gleamed brightly under the beautiful custom crystal chandelier. Everything was absolutely, completely perfect today. The first guest to arrive was my brilliant, ruthless attorney, Marcus. He walked through my heavy oak front door wearing a very relaxed beige linen suit instead of his usual intimidating dark courtroom attire. He carried a massive, expensive bottle of vintage French champagne to officially celebrate our incredible legal victory. I hugged him warmly, completely grateful for his absolute unwavering loyalty and his incredible legal brilliance during the darkest moments of my entire life. Shortly after Marcus arrived, my former mentee Julian stepped into the beautiful bright foyer. Julian was the brilliant bank vice president who had helped me completely freeze Bradley's fraudulent corporate accounts. Julian brought his beautiful, intelligent wife and their 2 young, wonderful children. The massive house was quickly filled with the beautiful, joyful sounds of incredible, genuine laughter and completely innocent children playing happily in the spacious living room. I also invited several of my oldest and most incredibly trusted personal friends. These were the incredibly strong, successful Black women who had supported me completely after my beloved husband Marcus passed away several years ago. They were women who intimately understood the massive, unique struggles of building and protecting generational wealth in a completely unforgiving corporate world. We all gathered together inside the massive formal dining room. The atmosphere was completely different from the terrible corporate launch party Bradley had attempted to host. There was absolutely no fake networking or pathetic, desperate posturing. There was only incredibly deep, genuine love, mutual, absolute respect, and incredibly powerful shared wisdom. We sat down together at the beautiful long table and began to pass the massive, heavy bowls of delicious, warm food to one another. The conversation flowed incredibly smoothly around the massive dining table. We laughed loudly about the incredibly pathetic look on Bradley's face when the federal agents completely tackled him to the grass. We shared incredibly brilliant stories about our own personal legal victories and our massive professional successes over the years. We celebrated the incredibly powerful absolute strength of women who completely refused to be silenced or intimidated by incredibly arrogant, mediocre men. I looked around the beautiful dining table and felt my heart swell with massive, incredible joy. This was my true, chosen family. These were the incredibly loyal people who actively earned the absolute right to sit at my table and share my incredible, massive wealth. They did not feel entitled to my money, and they did not ever try to steal my personal legacy. They completely respected my boundaries, and they deeply valued my incredible friendship today. As the beautiful, wonderful dinner slowly wound down to an end, I decided it was exactly the right time to make a formal speech. I did not tap a silver spoon against a crystal glass like a pathetic, desperate attention seeker. I simply stood up slowly from the head of the massive dining table. The entire room completely quieted down immediately, showing their absolute deep respect for my position as the matriarch of the house. I picked up my crystal glass, filled with my late husband's favorite expensive vintage red wine. I looked out at the incredibly beautiful faces of my wonderful chosen family. I felt a massive wave of incredible deep gratitude wash completely over my entire soul today. I want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight. I began my voice completely steady and filled with incredible deep warmth. Over the past few months, I faced an incredibly dark, massive betrayal from the very people who were supposed to love and protect me the most. I was completely thrown out of my own beautiful home into the freezing rain. I was completely disrespected and intentionally targeted by an incredibly malicious, pathetic thief. But sitting here looking at all of your beautiful faces tonight, I finally realize that losing my completely toxic family members was actually the greatest massive blessing of my entire long life. The entire dining table nodded in completely silent, incredible agreement. I learned that true family is absolutely not defined by shared blood or legal marriage documents. I continued incredibly smoothly. True family is defined by absolute mutual respect, unwavering deep loyalty, and the ability to completely honor personal boundaries. I learned that you absolutely cannot save people who are actively determined to destroy themselves completely. You simply have to step back safely and allow incredibly arrogant fools to completely dig their own massive graves. And most importantly, I learned that complete, absolute silence is often the most incredibly terrifying and powerful weapon a strong, intelligent woman can ever possibly wield. I raised my crystal glass slightly higher into the warm evening air. So tonight we are completely celebrating the incredible absolute power of setting incredibly firm boundaries. I declared, my voice ringing out clearly and powerfully across the beautiful, quiet dining room. We are completely celebrating the absolute legal destruction of completely toxic, entitled men, and we are completely celebrating the beautiful, profound peace that only comes when you permanently remove massive toxic energy from your personal private sanctuary. Cheers to absolute incredible peace and total, complete financial security forever. The entire table raised their beautiful crystal glasses high into the air and loudly echoed my wonderful, joyful toast. The gentle clinking of the expensive crystal glasses sounded exactly like a beautiful, peaceful symphony in my completely reclaimed, beautiful home. We spent the rest of the incredibly beautiful evening drinking the vintage wine and eating massive slices of delicious sweet potato pie. The heavy dark shadow of Bradley and Nia was completely, permanently erased from my entire beautiful, successful life. I was officially back sitting on my rightful throne as the incredibly powerful, absolute queen of my own massive financial empire today. As my wonderful guests finally began to slowly leave the beautiful estate later that night, I stood completely alone on my massive grand stone patio. I looked out over the perfectly manicured green lawn where Bradley had been violently tackled and forcefully arrested in steel handcuffs. The warm, gentle night breeze rustled softly through the large, ancient oak trees, completely blowing away the final lingering remnants of his massive, incredible, pathetic failure. My beautiful $2.5 million house was finally completely quiet and entirely safe once again. I had completely won the massive, brutal war, and I had successfully protected my incredible, massive assets entirely. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that my brilliant mind and my fierce independence were absolutely untouchable. Sometimes the loudest roar you can make is complete silence while you let the law do the talking. Have you ever let someone think they won just before you pulled the rug out from under them? Tell me your story in the comments. And remember, ladies, protect your peace and protect your assets. If you enjoyed this incredibly satisfying story of absolute, complete revenge, please make sure to hit that subscribe button immediately and share this exact video with anyone who desperately needs a strong, powerful reminder to never, ever let anyone disrespect their incredible boundaries. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my beautiful journey today.